Margaery Tyrell stood upon the balcony of the great Septon King's Landing, where pale columns reached like fingers toward the sky. A dry, golden sunlight stretched across the tiles beneath her slippers, and the hush that had fallen across the city seemed almost sacred. Her hands rested calmly along the balustrade. She wore an expression that bespoke warmth and quiet confidence. Behind her, the sprawling rooftops glinted with the pastel hues of dawn, while bells tolled in the distance to mark the early hour. Even the air smelled somewhat different these days, fresher, for in the last few moons the city's refuse no longer simply rotted in the streets without protest. The faith militant had arrived to set cleanliness in King's Landing to a standard never before demanded. At her back, the sound of sandaled feet slipped across the polished floor. She did not turn immediately, merely closed her eyes in brief reflection. It had been 2 weeks since she had stood before the High Sparrow and agreed to offer her devotion, not just as a pious show of humility, but as an act of cunning. Everyone had underestimated the newest queen, everyone, that is, except the High Sparrow himself. She could feel his presence behind her, austere and composed, though there was beneath his collected exterior a subtle respect for the woman who had come to him seeking an arrangement more beneficial to them both. Long before that arrangement, there had been the game of courtesy. When Margaery's brother Loras had first been imprisoned, she had played the dutiful queen, her face drawn with sorrow. She had knelt for hours in the sept, praying as tears trickled down her cheeks. All that time, she paid close attention to the new power center forming around this devout, almost ascetic figure who called himself the High Sparrow. He was calm and mild, with eyes that saw through pretense. Day by day, she watched the crowds gather around him, their faith renewed or perhaps reawakened by hunger and hopelessness, finding in him a champion of the downtrodden. Meanwhile, the nobles sneered or smirked, believing that this holy man was but a passing fad. She had tested him. The High Sparrow had no desire for gold, no interest in flattery, no thirst for a new seat of power in the keep. All he wanted, it seemed, was the city's moral purification and the resurgence of a faith that recognized the rule of the seven above all else. He wanted an honest queen, a virtuous realm, and Margaery, possessed of a shrewdness carefully cultivated by Olenna Tyrell's teachings, knew that virtuous was an infinitely adjustable concept, especially when the small folk were so eager for a guiding star. Perhaps the High Sparrow did genuinely intend to rid the city of its depravity. Margaery, however, saw him as a means toward an alliance that might at last secure her place in a pit of vipers, lions, and wolves. When the High Sparrow finally stood before her in private, each candle dancing in the gloom of the sept, she saw a quiet man with Spartan robes, hair as white as the feathers of an egret, and eyes that reflected in them both compassion and an unbending will. For the first time, he said to her, "Your Grace, one cannot build a realm upon the quicksand of sin." She smiled. In that moment, a hush lingered between them that held the entire future in question. She had not come alone, of course, no queen would, but she brought no Tyrell guard or ladies from her retinue. Instead, she brought a single piece of parchment carefully folded, with her personal sigil pressed in wax. In that letter lay certain truths about the depravity at King's Landing's heart, details about certain lords' secret dealings, the flow of coin to the brothels that financed them, and possible evidence of the Queen Mother's involvement in events that might prove uncomfortable if widely known. Margaery had spent nearly a month gathering these scraps of information. Such secrets were not easy to coax into the open, but the city's underbelly hummed with so many rumors. It simply required an attentive ear, a silver coin in the right palm, a whispered promise. She held that parchment out to the High Sparrow. He took it, lips slightly parted in surprise, for it was not often that one received damning evidence from a queen. As he read, Margaery studied his face. It hardened, grew sorrowful, but also determined. He recognized the gift for what it was, a powerful wedge, a tool that allowed the faith militant a new foothold in matters of the court. "Queen Margaery," he said when he finished reading, "what is it you seek?" She lowered her eyes, letting the candlelight catch in the corners of her tearful gaze. "I seek my brother's freedom. I seek justice. Lancel Lannister's testimony against Ser Loras is..." "It is a game of false allegations and rumor," she interrupted softly. "I beg you to see the truth." She raised her gaze then, leaning forward, speaking in a confident hush. "Ser Loras is not pure in the eyes of the faith, yes, but many in King's Landing are impure as well. Should we not be mindful that the Queen Mother's ambitions have guided these accusations? This matter is not simply about the faith or about protecting the people from sin. It is about Cersei Lannister trying to destroy her rivals. The Tyrells have long served the crown. We are loyal, yet we bear the brunt of her wrath all too often." He considered her for a moment before replying, "If justice is your aim, then you will have my ear. But I cannot set aside sin simply because it is inconvenient for you, your grace. Are you prepared to meet the faith with honesty? Will you do what is required to show the people that none are above the Seven's laws?" She nodded calmly, her voice resolute. "I will, and in return, I trust the faith will respond with equal fairness. The laws of the Seven must not be used as a mask for Lannister grievances." The High Sparrow said nothing, but his silence was telling. That night, they spoke for nearly 2 hours, and in the flicker of candle flames, an alliance was formed, delicate as a spider's thread, but with the potential to bind a city. It was that alliance Margaery contemplated now, leaning over the marble balustrade, feeling the salt-laced breeze that rolled in from Blackwater Bay. Footsteps came to a halt behind her. She pivoted to see the High Sparrow, staff in hand, eyes calmly alight with subdued fervor. He regarded her with a slight tilt of his head. "Your Grace, the days ahead bring the trials of many. We must ensure that the truth emerges unclouded by the wealth or power of the guilty. I trust you have everything prepared?" she asked, gently smoothing her bodice. In the time since their arrangement began, Margaery had subtly changed her dress. Lighter fabrics, higher necklines, less ornamentation. Where once she displayed the Tyrell rose in golden thread, she now wore simpler patterns. The city's small folk gossiped that the Queen was beginning to reflect the humility of the faith itself. If that gave them hope and made them adore her all the more, then it was a wise strategy. Her grandmother, the Queen of Thorns, had taught her that generosity, or even the mere appearance of generosity, could be the strongest blade in the Game of Thrones. The High Sparrow nodded in response to her question. "I have called upon a meeting of the faith militant. By noon, the city shall know of it. And there is something else." He cleared his throat. "A new witness has come forth, one who can illuminate the truth behind these charges aimed at Ser Loras." Her heart trembled at the thought that the witness might bring only further condemnation. "May I ask who?" "An anointed brother," he said, but Margaery could see the flicker in his gaze. He too was wary. "I will interview this witness first. If he speaks the truth, we shall consider how it impacts Ser Loras's trial. If it is lies, then perhaps we shall discover who put him up to them." She bowed her head, gently folding her hands. "Thank you," she said, voice hushed with sincerity. "I will see to it that we provide the necessary courtesy for your men if they must come to the Red Keep. The king, my husband, he believes in the Seven as any good ruler should. He will not hinder your efforts." She said those words well aware of how Tommen, sweet boy that he was, had become a tool for those with sharper wits. In her mind, she saw Cersei's face contort in a sneer whenever Margaery dared to walk in the same corridor. Cersei's entire being radiated jealousy and suspicion. The Queen Mother believed she could control all pieces on the board, but Margaery was not a piece to be nudged aside. She would show the realm that Cersei was not the only one who could plot and manipulate in the shadows. The High Sparrow nodded. "Then we shall proceed." His voice was soft but firm. "May the Seven guide you, Queen Margaery." As he left her, a swirl of tension spun in the air. Margaery had taken a perilous step by forming this entente with the faith. All alliances in King's Landing were precarious, but this one was especially so. She turned back to the city, letting her eyes sweep the rooftops. She had no illusions. This was not a friendship forged in the rosy glow of mutual admiration. It was a deal. She gave the faith the means to strike at those who placed themselves above the Seven's laws, and in return, the High Sparrow would show more leniency when it came to Loras and to Margaery's own place beside Tommen. But that leniency would come at a price. Margaery must play the penitent queen, pious and modest, shining a moral light that might illuminate Cersei's darkness. It was a role she could manage, one that would win the hearts of the small folk all the more. As the sun rose higher, she returned to the Red Keep with a modest retinue of guards and ladies, ensuring her outward show of humility was in place. She set about her daily tasks, offering prayers in the sept within the castle walls, visiting Tommen to share a meal and console him as a wife should. Yet she sensed how uneasy he was. The boy king might have lion's blood in his veins, but he was more kitten than lion. The mention of Loras's name made him shuffle his feet and stammer about the faith's power. She reassured him that it was all in the Seven's hands, that if her brother was innocent, surely the truth would prevail. That afternoon, while she stitched at a tapestry with a circle of ladies, Margaery listened discreetly to the chatter. Many had heard rumors that the faith intended something drastic. Some claimed the faith militant would soon ban prostitution, others that they sought to impose new taxes on the city's wealthy families. None of the ladies could confirm what was fact and what was rumor. As they prattled on, Margaery's mind wandered to the upcoming interviews in the Great September. Already, the High Sparrow had scheduled new audiences with the lords and ladies who might or might not stand accused of sin. A short while later, a maiden in pale green shyly touched Margaery's elbow. "Your Grace," she whispered. "You have a visitor. He says he's from the faith." Margaery nodded. "Thank you, Roslyn. Show him to the small solar." She rose, politely excusing herself from the circle of women, leaving behind the chatter of idle gossip and needlework. In the small solar, sunlight fell in beams upon a polished oak table. A slender, pious-looking young man stood waiting. He looked neither particularly imposing nor special, one of the faith's many novices, presumably, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "My Lady Queen," he said with a respectful bow. "The High Sparrow bids me deliver a message." "Go on," she said, settling into a chair. "There is a matter that requires your attention, and swiftly." A man came to the sept this morning with knowledge of certain lapses in Queen Mother Cersei's virtue. He also professed knowledge regarding Ser Loras. The High Sparrow has asked that you come to the sept tomorrow at midday to attend an interview. Margaery's heart quickened. "Whose interview is this?" "The man's name is Osney Kettleblack." She smiled faintly. She recalled the Kettleblack brothers, footpads raised to knighthood by the Lannisters, serving more as Cersei's personal muscle than anything else. If Osney was prepared to speak about lapses in Cersei's virtue, that might be exactly the thread that could unravel Cersei's defenses at last. The question was whether it was a trap. "Tell the High Sparrow," she said. "I shall be there." The novice bowed and departed, leaving Margaery alone with her swirling thoughts. She stared at a beam of light cutting across the stone floor, dust dancing in the air. This was it, the chance to strike at Cersei. She must be ready. That night, Margaery penned a message to her grandmother, Olenna Tyrell, who was back at Highgarden, monitoring from afar. She kept the note brief and coded, referencing only that a new bloom was about to open in King's Landing. If Olenna understood, and Margaery had no doubt that she would, reinforcements of a more political nature might soon arrive. Then she waited. The hours stretched. She passed them by continuing her outward display of piety, visiting the orphans, offering coin for the poor, making an appearance in the castle sept to recite prayers for her brother's freedom. The castle servants observed her as if she might break into sobs at any moment. So devoted was she to Loras. Perhaps some of the tears were real, for she did worry about him. Alone in a cell, forced to endure cold, hunger, and the looming prospect of punishment. But she could not let emotion blind her to the necessity of cunning. By noon of the following day, Margaery arrived at the Great September, wearing a modest gown of pale lilac, her hair partially covered by a light, ornate veil. The city's small folk had gathered along the route, chattering excitedly when they glimpsed their beloved queen. Margaery offered them gentle smiles, brief waves, and calm eye contact, letting them see how unbowed she was despite her troubles. The king did not accompany her. She had counseled him to remain in the Red Keep, so as not to be entangled in a scene he was ill-prepared to handle. Inside the sept, massive windows spilled kaleidoscopes of colored light across the floor. Rows of the devout knelt in prayer, but parted as Margaery proceeded. At the far side, near the altar, stood the High Sparrow with a small group of his followers. And off to one side, kept under guard by 2 faith militant, stood Osney Kettleblack, a gangly man with a sour, anxious face. Margaery approached, dipping her head respectfully to the High Sparrow. He gestured for her to join him. Osney's eyes darted between them. He was clearly uncertain about how events might unfold. "Your Holiness," he began, voice trembling with contrition, "I am ready to speak of the sins I have committed." "Speak freely, child," said the High Sparrow. Osney hesitated, shifting his weight. Margaery folded her hands, keeping her expression neutral. She was keenly aware that many a cunning lie had been spun in these halls, but she trusted the High Sparrow's watchful presence to help separate truth from cunning. "I was in service to Queen Mother Cersei," Osney began, dropping his gaze to the floor. "She tasked my brothers and me with various duties. Sometimes those duties were not holy." "Go on." He took a breath. "She wanted me to testify against Ser Loras Tyrell. She said it would weaken House Tyrell's influence. She promised me knighthood, gold, any number of rewards if I would help bring them down. But that was only part of it." He glanced nervously at Margaery, then back to the High Sparrow. "I also had relations with the Queen Mother herself." Margaery blinked to conceal her shock. She had suspected the Kettleblacks were privy to many of Cersei's secrets. She had heard, in hushed rumors, that one or more of them might have shared her bed. But to hear Osney confess it so bluntly was still surprising. The High Sparrow's expression darkened with disapproval. A Queen Mother, sworn to chastity after her king's passing, indulged in adultery and fornication? "Yes," Osney whispered. "She did. And more than once." The High Sparrow's gaze flicked to Margaery, who maintained a calm, polite mask. Then he returned his attention to Osney. "Why do you confess this now?" Osney licked his lips, wringing his hands. "I cannot go on with these sins upon my conscience. The Seven sees all. I fear for my soul, and I fear for what might happen if I remain loyal to her. She has turned against me anyway." Margaery inhaled slowly. She suspected Osney had concluded that a scapegoat might be required for the fiasco with Ser Loras's accusation, and that scapegoat would be him. Or perhaps he was just foolish enough to believe the faith could protect him if he turned on Cersei. Regardless, he was offering the High Sparrow precisely the kind of testimony that could tear Cersei down. "I ask the Seven for forgiveness," Osney muttered, "and I stand ready to face punishment for my role in the false accusations." The High Sparrow nodded gravely. "We shall see to that, Osney Kettleblack. But first, your testimony must be verified. We will not damn another soul on the basis of lies." "I swear on all the Seven," Osney insisted, voice trembling with fervor. "I speak the truth." The High Sparrow turned to Margaery, gesturing for her to follow him away from the others. They stepped aside, letting the novices keep watch on Osney. In a hushed voice, the High Sparrow spoke. "If this man speaks truly, the condemnation of the Queen Mother is inevitable. It would lend enormous weight to your claim that Ser Loras was falsely accused. The boy could be exonerated. Then you believe him? We shall see. I have ways to test his sincerity, questions that shall lay bare the truth. But if he is proven truthful, I would see justice done. That means a trial for the Queen Mother, overseen by the faith militant, to examine the charges of fornication, treason, and false witness." Margaery felt a rush of excitement, carefully concealed. The faith would place the Queen Mother on trial? His eyes were unwavering. "No one is above the laws of the Seven. Not a king's mother, not a king's wife. As you have pledged your sincerity, so I expect sincerity from all." Margaery bowed her head. "Then we shall see that justice is done. That is all I desire." But in truth, she desired more. She desired to finally be free of Cersei's manipulations. If the Faith had the Queen Mother in their grasp, then for the first time, Margaery and House Tyrell could maneuver in King's Landing without her looming presence. She took her leave shortly thereafter, letting the High Sparrow continue his interrogation of Osney. She walked back through the city with her retinue. A small sense of triumph pulsed through her, though she reminded herself to remain vigilant. Cersei was cunning, and cornered beasts often lashed out with lethal desperation. That very evening, Margaery received word that Cersei had summoned her. Under normal circumstances, Margaery might have demurred, but she was curious as to whether Cersei had caught wind of Osney's defection or the gathering storms in the Sept. She met the Queen Mother in her private drawing room. The gold and crimson draperies fluttered in the breeze from an open window. The sweet scent of arbor wine mingled with candle wax. Cersei turned from the window as Margaery entered, and for a fleeting moment, Margaery thought she detected a slight tension in Cersei's face, a tightness around her eyes as though she'd been pacing. "Your Grace," Margaery said, dipping a shallow curtsy. Cersei's hair fell in lustrous waves around her shoulder. And she wore a tight black gown embroidered with golden lions at the sleeves. She tried for a placid smile, but Margaery saw only malice behind it. "Margaery," Cersei said. She did not say Queen Margaery. Never had. "I hear you've been attending services at the Great September rather diligently these past weeks." "I have," Margaery replied, stepping forward with a calm grace. "I find comfort in prayer, especially when times are difficult." "Oh yes, indeed, times are difficult," Cersei said, a note of bitterness creeping into her tone. "Is that how you would describe your brother's predicament?" "Difficult," Margaery offered a sigh. "I pray day and night for Loras's deliverance. The Faith has shown mercy in granting him a fair trial. I cannot ask for more." "Indeed, the Faith," Cersei said, pursing her lips. "They grow bolder by the day, with their militant parading in the streets. All in the name of the Seven." She shook her head. "It's quite the shift, wouldn't you say, from how things were under my late husband's reign?" Margaery simply inclined her head. "Some might call it a necessary revival of moral guidance," she said gently. Cersei's green eyes flickered with disdain. "Moral guidance," she echoed, her voice dangerously soft. "And do tell me, dear, what moral guidance does the High Sparrow offer your brother for his alleged proclivities?" It was a cheap blow, and Margaery refused to be baited. "I have faith that the truth will be seen and that justice will follow. That is all I can say." She glanced around the room, noting the decanter of wine near Cersei's elbow. "Your Grace, was there something you wished to discuss with me specifically?" Cersei pressed her lips together, as though carefully choosing her words. Then she said, "There are rumors that the Faith is preparing charges against certain individuals at court. Grave charges, I hear: adultery, regicide, treason. As Queen Mother, I must ensure the stability of the realm. Have you heard anything concrete regarding these rumors?" Margaery recognized the tension hidden in that question. "I've heard many rumors. So many, in fact, that I rarely know which ones to believe." Cersei's voice hardened. "If the Faith grows too powerful, they may see fit to point their accusing fingers at any of us, even the Queen. You should be wary, Margaery. You once stood accused of lying to the Faith. They might yet revisit those allegations. It is in all our interests to ensure we present a united front, Lannister and Tyrell alike." "A united front?" Margaery repeated softly. "Does that extend to ensuring my brother's safety?" "Of course," Cersei said with a brittle smile. "We both want the same thing, a stable realm, no tragedies. If we work together, we can ensure that the Faith does not overstep." Margaery took a measured breath, trying to hide her revulsion at Cersei's hypocrisy. She might have admired it, had it not been aimed at her. "Then perhaps we shall speak again about this cooperation. For now, I can only tell you that I have no knowledge of any new accusations. I am but a humble queen, pious and devout. I pray the Seven keep us all safe." With that, She offered another curtsy, politely refusing Cersei's request to share wine. She excused herself, leaving the Queen Mother glowering. As she stepped into the corridor, Margaery felt the tension in her shoulders. She had to keep playing her part well. The docile, pious queen, not the cunning orchestrator who had fed the faith enough secrets to topple a regime. Still, she wondered how soon news of Osney's confession would reach Cersei. If it had not already, it would soon. That very night, ravens flew out from the Red Keep, though Margaery knew not to whom. She suspected Cersei was stirring up trouble, perhaps seeking the counsel of Qyburn or other questionable allies. For the first time, Margaery lay awake until the bells tolled past midnight, her mind alive with the possibilities. The final confrontation was drawing near. For days later, the High Sparrow summoned Cersei to the great September. Rumors raced across the city as she departed in her lavish litter, escorted by gold-cloaked Lannister guards. Margaery, from a distant vantage, watched the procession snake through the crowds. No one cheered Cersei's passage the way they did Margaery's. The small folk watched with suspicion or, in some cases, thinly veiled hostility. Cersei had never learned how to endear herself to the people. By mid-afternoon, Margaery received word that the Queen Mother had not emerged from the Great September, that she was being detained by the Faith Militant pending an investigation. The news brought a fierce tremor of victory to Margaery's chest. She struggled to maintain her composure before her maids, only allowing herself the barest smile. Later that evening, the High Sparrow's novice visited her again in the Red Keep. He delivered the news. Queen Mother Cersei stands accused of adultery, fornication, high treason, and also of conspiring to falsely accuse Ser Loras Tyrell. She shall face trial before the Seven. Margaery clasped her hands. And Loras? The Faith has agreed to set aside the bulk of the charges in light of the new confessions, the novice said, voice carefully neutral. He must still atone for his personal sins, but the severity of the punishment may be mitigated. He will soon be released from his cell, once formalities are observed. A thrill of relief coursed through her. Thank the Seven, she murmured. She took a deep breath and regained her regal poise. Please inform the High Sparrow that I am grateful, and that I will continue to offer prayers for the salvation of all. The novice bowed and departed. Before the day was done, Margaery made her way to Tommen's chambers, finding him pale and distressed. He had heard the news that his mother was being held by the Faith and was frantic. How could they do this? He demanded, voice trembling. She is the Queen Mother. My mother. I need to order the Faith Militant to release her at once. She calmed him, soothing him with gentle touches. My love, she said, voice hushed. I know this must be difficult, but the Faith has discovered grave accusations against her. If you interfere, if you attempt to break her out, it will be seen as an act of war against the Faith. The city's people might revolt, the Faith Militant might. She didn't finish the thought. Tommen's face quivered. I just want my mother safe. She will have a trial, Margaery said. If she is innocent, she will be freed. But the Seven must be allowed to judge. You must trust the process. She took his hands in hers. It is the only way, Tommen. He looked close to tears, but Margaery continued to reassure him, holding him in her arms. She felt a pang of pity for the boy. He was so young, so sheltered. Had he been older, more experienced, perhaps he would not have let the Faith Militant gain such power, or perhaps he would have recognized this as the price for justice in King's Landing. Word soon spread throughout the city that the Queen Mother had been cast into a cell for her sins. At first, a silent shock permeated the court. Then, like a swarm of startled ravens, the courtiers hurried to align themselves either with the Faith or with the king. Lords and ladies arrived to pay homage to Margaery, offering condolences for the predicament of Ser Loras, even though it was well on its way to resolution, and to express shock at the accusations leveled against Cersei. Margaery accepted these visits with grace, aware that each flattery was a subtle request for Tyrell favor or a shield from the Faith's gaze. She listened carefully, gleaning which courtiers had soiled secrets of their own. Finally, the day of Loras's release arrived. The High Sparrow allowed it to be a solemn occasion, with no fanfare or parade, as Loras left the sept in the early dawn hours. Margaery and a small group of Tyrell guards waited to greet him. He looked thinner, paler, with shadows under his eyes. Yet, when he saw his sister, a flicker of relief crossed his weary features. "Margaery," he said, voice hoarse. She went to him, embracing him. "I've missed you, dear brother." He held onto her for a moment, sagging in her arms. She felt the trembling in his limbs and realized how broken he might be inside. As the Knight of Flowers, he had once been bright, confident, and sure of his place in the world. This imprisonment had shaken him. She hoped that in time he might recover. For now, she was simply grateful he was free. They escorted him back to a Tyrell holdfast in the city, away from the Red Keep for the moment, to let him rest and recuperate. On the walk, he asked quietly, "How did you manage this? I thought the faith was immovable." She offered a gentle, secretive smile. "The High Sparrow and I came to an understanding. It cost us, but it was worth it to see you free." He frowned. "And what of the charges against me?" "They remain in a diminished form. You may be called upon to pledge yourself to the faith's will, perhaps even take the sword and star for a time, or make other penances. But you're not going to rot in a cell. We've ensured that." He nodded, though he appeared confused. "And what of Cersei? I heard rumors." "She stands accused," Margaery said softly. "She will face a trial. I believe the faith means to hold it soon." Loras's lips parted in surprise. For a moment, he almost smiled, as if the notion of Cersei imprisoned was too surreal to accept. All this has happened so swiftly, swifter than she could ever have expected, Margaery said, her eyes shining with quiet satisfaction. "We struck before she had time to unravel our plans. Now be at peace, brother. Rest. Tomorrow we'll speak more." That night, Margaery gathered with a small circle of Tyrell retainers and supporters. They dined modestly, for outwardly, they were to be humble these days. But there was an undercurrent of victory in the room. Her grandmother, Olenna, had not yet returned from Highgarden, but her letters expressed savage delight at the turn of events. "It is time we pressed our advantage," said Ser Talland of the Reach, leaning forward across the table. "The Lannisters are in disarray. Kevin Lannister is away, and Cersei is caged. The king is but a boy. The city is in need of strong leadership, and that leadership belongs to House Tyrell." Margaery sipped her watered wine, carefully composing her response. "We must tread carefully. The faith holds the Queen Mother, and their goodwill is what keeps Loras safe from further prosecution. They see me as a devout queen who shares their virtues. We must not reveal that our ambition goes beyond bringing justice to Cersei's sins." Ser Talland inclined his head. "Understood, Your Grace, but the opportunity is there. If the faith continues, they will isolate the Lannisters further. Soon, they may turn on the king himself, if they perceive him as too lenient. That would be chaos." Margaery nodded thoughtfully. "We must ensure Tommen remains allied with the faith, at least enough to keep the peace. My marriage stands, of course." She sighed softly. "Poor boy is frightened. He's lost his mother to a cell. I do not wish him harm." The conversation carried on until late, each retainer offering opinions on how to manage the new power balance. Margaery listened, gleaning bits of strategy, but ultimately, she made it clear that they would maintain a low profile, allowing the faith to take the brunt of any public condemnation for the trial. Meanwhile, House Tyrell would quietly fortify its connections, controlling the king through kindness and gentle persuasion. She need not hurry. The seeds were planted. It was best to let them bloom at their own pace. A fortnight later, the High Sparrow announced the date of the Queen Mother's trial. The news spread across King's Landing like wildfire. Some of the small folk muttered in dark corners that the faith had no right to judge the Lannisters. Others, emboldened by the faith militants' presence, rejoiced at the sight of a proud noblewoman humbled. The day arrived with an overcast sky that pressed down upon the city like a heavy, gray cloak. Inside the Great September, hundreds of spectators, including lesser lords, wealthy merchants, and curious small folk crowded the aisles. The faith militants stood in ranks, austere and resolute, ensuring order. Margaery and Tommen sat upon a pair of carved seats near the front, with the High Sparrow at the central dais. An elevated platform had been erected for the accused. Cersei, in a plain woolen gown, her hair unkempt, stood with a tension in her posture that verged on fury. Yet she tried to appear unbowed, arms straight at her sides, chin lifted. Silence reigned as the High Sparrow approached the dais. He recited the charges, voice echoing across the cavernous space. Adultery, incest, high treason, murder, conspiracy, false testimony. Cersei stood rigid, lips pressed in a grim line, her green eyes scanning the crowd. She spotted Margaery, and Margaery did not flinch from that venomous gaze. Beside her, Tommen swallowed hard, his face pale. One by one, witnesses were called. Osney Kettleblack gave his damning account, supported by bits of evidence gleaned from other sources. Servants who had glimpsed suspicious visits, letters that hinted at bribes. Lancel Lannister also offered testimony about the wine that had contributed to King Robert's death and about his own illicit relations with the Queen Mother. Murmurs rippled through the September. Even the sturdiest pillars seemed to resonate with the shock of it all. As the High Sparrow prompted each witness, Cersei's face grew taut, rage sparking in her eyes. She denied everything, called them all liars. When the High Sparrow asked if anyone would speak in her defense, the hall fell quiet. She glowered at the assembled crowd, searching for a champion, a protector. But Jaime Lannister was absent, away on a mission. Ser Kevin Lannister had not arrived in time. The king, sitting near Margaery, seemed paralyzed. Finally, Grand Maester Pycelle stood, hobbled forward, and offered a vague statement about the Queen Mother's devotion to her children. It was half-hearted at best. The High Sparrow's voice carried solemnly. The faith finds sufficient cause to believe that the Queen Mother has sinned grievously against the laws of the Seven. She shall be judged accordingly. Cersei's fists clenched. She cast a final, seething look at Margaery, then at Tommen. "Will you do nothing?" she hissed, though only those near the front could hear her. Tommen quivered, unable to respond. The High Sparrow gestured for silence. "Queen Mother Cersei, by the authority granted me by the Seven, I pronounce you guilty of fornication and false witness, pending the ordeal of the holy trial for the additional charges. Should you wish to atone, you must." Her voice burst forth. "I will speak my confession." She had realized there was no escape if she did not yield. A hush fell as she took a trembling breath. "I confess to bedding Lancel and others." Her cheeks burned, and tears glistened with humiliation. "But I deny the more monstrous charges: murder, incest, high treason. Those are vile lies. I beg the Seven's mercy for my fleshly sins. I ask only to be allowed to see my son, the king." Her voice cracked in desperation. The High Sparrow studied her calmly. "The faith shall have mercy, but you must complete the penance so that your soul may be cleansed. The city must see that no one is above the laws of the Seven." A flicker of dread crossed Cersei's face. She had heard of the penance demanded of highborn ladies who confessed to sins of the flesh. A walk, naked, humiliated before all. Seeing her color fade, Margaery recalled the day she herself had nearly faced the same fate. Had the faith's suspicion remained untempered. It was a terrible, brutal form of public shame. Yet the crowd thirsted for the spectacle of highborn sinners cast low. Margaery realized that moment was approaching. She glanced at Tommen, who stared in horror as the wheels of justice turned. The next morning, with a cold wind whipping through King's Landing, the stage was set for Cersei's walk of penance. The faith militant escorted her from the Great September, stripped of her gown. The novices handed her a simple shift, then cut away her hair in ragged clumps, leaving it uneven. A bell tolled, and the High Sparrow proclaimed her sins. Margaery stood among a throng near the steps, her own hood drawn low, Tommen not present by her urging. She would not subject him to this horror. Cersei took her first step out into the street. The shift clung to her trembling body. She tried to hold her head high, But the jeers, the catcalls, the insults hurled by the crowd battered her. The path from the Sept to the Red Keep was long, and the faith militant parted the mob to allow her progress. She stumbled several times, knees striking the ground, tears mixing with spit as some hurled disgusting slurs and threw rotting vegetables. Though Margaery felt little sympathy for Cersei after all the harm she had caused, she found the scene almost too harrowing to watch. Still, she stood firm. The High Sparrow had orchestrated all of this with her knowledge, though not necessarily at her request. Yet it served a purpose, the dethroning of the Lannister Queen Mother, the final stroke of humiliation that would render her powerless in the eyes of the people. By the time Cersei reached the Red Keep, she was caked in filth, her feet cut and bleeding. She disappeared through the gatehouse, and the cheering died away, replaced by a collective exhale among the crowd. Margaery withdrew, ensuring the spectacle's final images would be carved into the minds of all who witnessed it. In the aftermath, the realm buzzed with talk of how the Lannisters had been brought low by the faith, and how the Tyrell queen had emerged unscathed. Letters arrived from distant lords, congratulating Margaery on her continued grace, her brother's freedom, and praising her piety. Her grandmother wrote to say that House Tyrell's position had never looked stronger, advising Margaery to keep her wits about her. An enemy such as Cersei would not remain docile forever. Tommen, for his part, was deeply shaken. He visited his mother soon after her penance. She lay abed, refusing to speak except in muttered curses, her hair in awkward clumps. He emerged from the chamber in tears, turning to Margaery for solace. She held him, speaking soothingly, yet she felt a thrill of power. Cersei's hold on Tommen was broken. He would cling to Margaery now, for comfort, for love, and for counsel. A day later, she stood in the gardens of the Red Keep, near a trickling fountain, the afternoon sun winking through the leaves. A hush seemed to cloak the place, as though it sensed the city's changed balance. She cupped a rose from High Garden that had been transplanted here, admiring the rich purple tint of its petals. It was a testament to her house. Beautiful, elegant, and laced with hidden thorns. A soft footstep behind her made her turn. The High Sparrow approached, hands folded in his wide sleeves. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "a peace has settled over the city, however tenuous. The people have witnessed that justice can be done upon the mightiest of sinners." She studied him. In another life, she might have despised him for the raw cruelty of the penance walk. But the game of power demanded alliances, even uneasy ones. "Yes," she said softly, letting the rose slip from her fingers. "You have indeed shown them that no one is above the seven." He nodded. "You and I understand each other, Queen Margaery. We must ensure that this realm is led by virtue. Your position is secure now. However, you must not forget the vow you implicitly made when you sought the faith's aid, that you, too, would remain beyond reproach." She inclined her head. "I have no intention of straying from the path of virtue." His gaze flicked over the roses, the fountain, the arching vines that framed them. "The faith will remain vigilant. Should any in the court stray into sin, we shall respond in kind. Yet I sense in you a genuine desire to help the people, to rule with kindness and humility. I pray we can remain in accord." She let a faint smile form. "We shall." They shared a moment of silence, standing in the dappled sunlight. Though her mind churned with the complexities of the future, she kept her features serene. She had maneuvered past her greatest foe and ensured the survival of her brother, all in a single stroke. The faith, for their part, had gained an unassailable moral supremacy in the hearts of the small folk. But while they believed themselves purely motivated by righteousness, Margaery knew that no institution in King's Landing could remain untouched by ambition. Sooner or later, the High Sparrow would extend his gaze beyond Cersei, beyond petty sin, and look for further ways to shape the city's future. She must be ready for that. "Your Grace," he said softly, "I will leave you to your meditations." He turned and walked away, his sandaled feet quiet across the flagstones. Margaery lingered by the fountain, letting the swirl of water soothe her. As she inhaled, the air tasted of promise. If she could maintain this alliance, House Tyrell would stand unchallenged by the Lannisters, at least for a time. She could rule through Tommen, guiding his decisions, quietly shaping the city to reflect the Tyrell vision. There would be feasts and generosity for the small folk, a tempered version of the faith's strict laws to ensure stability without inciting rebellion. And should the day come when the High Sparrow's moral revolution threatened the crown itself, Margaery would be prepared, with all of the resources of Highgarden behind her. She allowed herself to recall the last look on Cersei's face before she was taken away for the walk. The flicker of outrage, shock, and desperate hatred. There was no doubt that Cersei Lannister despised her more than anyone alive. But for now, Cersei was no longer a threat. She was a caged lioness, wounded, humiliated, her roars echoing in an empty keep. In the following weeks, the city settled into a new normal. Loras, still recovering from his ordeal, spent his days reading in the courtyard of the Tyrell Holdfast, the bright sun on his pale face. Sometimes Margaery joined him, reminding him of simpler days in Highgarden, speaking of their father's rose gardens, the tournaments where he'd once dazzled the crowds. She saw him slowly healing, though he would never quite be the same. Meanwhile, at court, Margaery carried out her duties beside Tommen, diligently hearing petitions and granting small boons. She ensured the starving were fed with Tyrell grain shipments. She visited sick houses, escorted by a handful of faith militant as a gesture of solidarity. The people adored her, whispering that she was the kindest queen in living memory. Some even compared her to the long-lost good Queen Alysanne, wife to King Jaehaerys Targaryen, though Margaery carefully deflected such grand praise. All the while, she kept an eye on the Queen Mother's chambers. Cersei had returned to her rooms, her body battered and her pride in tatters. She seldom emerged. On the few occasions she did, she said little, a blank look in her green eyes. Some of her old coterie, like Qyburn, hovered around her, but her power was overshadowed by the faith. The gold cloaks still answered to the king, and the king answered to Margaery's gentle coaxing. One gray morning, a small raven arrived for Margaery. The note inside was brief. The rose blooms well. The city's walls are no longer the color of blood. But beware a wounded lion. Oh, Margaery couldn't help a smile. Her grandmother's words were ever direct. Even from Highgarden, Olenna was ensuring that the Tyrell foothold in King's Landing did not falter. Margaery took the note to her bedchamber and burned it by candle flame, letting the ashes scatter in a bowl. Tommen sometimes asked after his mother, worried about her isolation. Margaery would encourage him to visit, to offer her comfort. And visit he did, but each time he came away unsettled. "She barely speaks," he told Margaery one day, sinking onto a couch in her solar. "She just stares out the window or mumbles about how the faith humiliated her. She's so angry, but she can't do anything about it. I don't know how to help her." Margaery placed a soothing hand on his shoulder. "She has to find her own way to peace, Tommen. The best we can do is pray for her. The faith demands penance, not vengeance, but perhaps in time she will find forgiveness in her heart." He nodded, still looking miserable. "I wish things could go back to the way they were before." She leaned in, letting him rest his head against her. "We must look forward, not backward, my sweet king." She kissed his cheek and softly began to talk of how they might bring prosperity to the city's orphans and beggars. She quietly redirected his mind from Cersei's misery to the realm's needs, an easy enough task with Tommen's gentle heart. The months slipped by. King's Landing appeared surprisingly stable. The High Sparrow preached in the streets, encouraging modesty and charity. Petty crimes diminished under the faith's watchful eye. The brothels still existed, but they were forced into quieter corners, with fewer blatant displays. The city smelled a bit cleaner, or so Margaery told herself. Merchant ships came and went, trade flourished. House Tyrell's coffers bulged further with the spoils of a city that had learned to love their queen. Yet beneath the veneer, Margaery sensed a quiet tension. Some of the more corrupt nobles had fled or hidden themselves, while others resented the faith's new hold on the city. Whispers of possible alliances or conspiracies drifted through the corridors. Still, none could deny that Margaery Tyrell, in alliance with the High Sparrow, had outmaneuvered Cersei Lannister. Even so, the Queen Mother remained a potential danger, her hatred unquenched by defeat. Margaery would occasionally pass her in a corridor, each woman stiffening at the sight of the other. Cersei's eyes smoldered with repressed fury, though she lowered them in forced respect. Margaery was queen, after all, while Cersei was diminished. Once or twice, Margaery heard her muttering about witches' prophecies or the Tyrell whore, but she pretended not to hear. In private, though, Margaery prepared for the day Cersei might snap. She increased her guards, ensuring each was well paid and handpicked by House Tyrell. She cultivated an amicable relationship with Jaime, who had returned from his mission, though he was aloof and clearly troubled by the rumors surrounding Cersei's trial. Margaery extended olive branches to him, offering courtesy, but not revealing how deeply she had conspired with the faith. Then one night, a rider from the west arrived, battered and wounded, bearing tidings of potential strife. It seemed that the remnants of House Baratheon, along with certain disaffected lords, were stirring in the Stormlands, unhappy with the Lannister-Tyrell grip on the throne. There were also rumors from Dorne, unrest following the death of Prince Doran, fomented by Illyria Sand and the Sand Snakes. The realm was not at peace, not truly. Over supper, Margaery discussed the matter with Loras, who by then had regained enough of his old vigor to spar in the yard again. The High Sparrow might have demanded penance from him, but he had not demanded Loras renounce his sword forever. Loras wore the star of the faith upon his cloak, acknowledging his vow of repentance, but a Tyrell rose was still embroidered underneath. "The realm is always on the brink of something," Loras said wearily. "We must hold it together with all our might, or it will collapse." Margaery regarded him, remembering the carefree youth he once was. "The question is how best to respond to these rumblings," she said softly. "If war breaks out in the Stormlands, or if Dorne raises a rebellion, we will be forced to take action. And we must do so without fracturing our alliance with the faith." He nodded. "It would be wise to strengthen our position through marriage alliances, or at least negotiations. We cannot fight battles on too many fronts." She sighed, fingering the stem of a rose in a vase nearby. "I have already dispatched letters to certain lords, offering them the king's goodwill. But I fear the memory of Tywin Lannister's rule, combined with the faith's stern approach, has made some of them wary. They see a city under religious rule and wonder if their freedoms will be trampled next." He gave her a faint smile. "I trust you to navigate these waters, sister." The next weeks proved a whirlwind of letters, negotiations, and discreet manipulations. Margaery commanded the loyalty of many lords who favored a queen that combined Tyrell wealth with devout humility. She sent gifts to the Stormlands, reassured them of the crown's willingness to accommodate local governance, and quietly reminded them how swiftly the city's new moral regime had exposed and punished corruption. "Who among you does not wish to see corruption banished?" she wrote in one letter. "We desire only that each lord abide by the Seven's laws, that we might build a peaceful realm together." Rumors of open rebellion subsided to uneasy muttering. Dorne, however, remained in question. But with winter looming, the taste for war in the desert land might be tempered by the hardships of the season. Throughout it all, the High Sparrow maintained his unwavering presence, preaching to crowds, advising Margaery on matters of morality, and quietly ensuring that any who openly defied the faith paid a swift price in public condemnation or arrest. Some might call him tyrannical, but Margaery deftly cast him as a spiritual guide. She felt the balance she had struck was delicate but stable. And in the Red Keep's corridors, Cersei prowled like a wounded lioness, occasionally spitting curses at servants who dared to cross her path. There were evenings when Margaery caught a whiff of strong wine on the Queen Mother's breath, or saw her lurch unsteadily through the halls. The once proud lion had turned to bitterness, and many a gossip at court muttered that she would never reclaim the cunning that once made her feared. Then, late one night, Margaery was roused from her bed by a pounding on her door. Ser Talland, clad in half-fastened armor, stood with a wild look in his eyes. "Your Grace," "Come quickly," he said in a hushed, urgent voice. "Cersei Lannister is gone." Margaery threw on a robe, her pulse pounding. "Gone? How?" He shook his head. "We're not certain. Some say she left with Qyburn's assistance. Others claim she forced a guard to let her pass. All we know is that she's not in her chambers, and a stable boy reports that a single rider left through the postern gate." A chill ran through Margaery. Had Cersei fled the city? Had she gone to find Jaime or Kevin, or even to the Stormlands to sow discontent? This could be dangerous. A final blow from a cornered foe. "Alert the Faith Militant," Margaery said, steadying herself. "Tell them to dispatch riders to every road leading out of the city. She cannot have gone far. We must intercept her." Ser Talon bowed and hurried away. Margaery stood by her window, peering out at the dark city. The torches near the gates flickered, casting ghostly shapes. Even at this hour, some watchers might have glimpsed the fleeing Queen Mother. If the High Sparrow discovered her flight, he would demand she be returned for further penance, possibly for renewed punishment. The alliance with the Faith would hold, but there might be chaos as rumors spread that the humiliated lioness had escaped. She worried about Tommen's reaction. He would be distraught if he learned his mother had left without a farewell. That might cause him to question Margaery's guidance, to wonder why she had not prevented this. She needed to control the narrative. Quickly, she summoned 2 of her ladies and composed a letter to the High Sparrow, explaining that the Queen Mother had departed the Red Keep under the cover of darkness, presumably to avoid fulfilling the remainder of her penance. She asked that the Faith coordinate with her own men to locate Cersei peacefully and bring her back unharmed. With the letter sent, Margaery waited, mind spinning with the potential ramifications. If Cersei made it to Casterly Rock, or if she found some group of Sellswords, might she gather an army and seek revenge? Could she rally other nobles who resented the Faith's influence and see Margaery as an interloper from the Reach? The possibilities raked her mind. Yet a part of her relished the challenge. She had proven her mettle thus far. She would do so again. The night stretched on with no word from the riders. At dawn, Margaery tried to soothe Tommen, telling him only that his mother had gone on a personal pilgrimage to reflect upon her sins, that she would return in due time. He gazed at her with wide, childlike eyes, a mixture of relief and worry. She wished he were older, more capable of comprehending the precariousness of the situation. By noon, the Faith Militant reported that no trace of Cersei had been found on the Rose Road heading west. Another search party rode north along the King's Road. If she intended to circle around to the west by a different route, they might catch her there. Meanwhile, small folk whispered that the Queen Mother had run away in the night, unable to bear the shame forced upon her by the Faith. Some pitied her. Others laughed at her disgrace. But Margaery knew better than to laugh. A cunning mind like Cersei's could not be discounted, even if she was wounded. She had cunning and pride, and enough knowledge of the city's secret ways to slip out undetected. Margaery felt a heavy tension settle in her chest. She confided in Loras that evening, in the quiet of his chambers. "She's out there, Loras," she said, pacing by the window. "She'll bide her time, gather what strength she can. We must be ready. She will lash out at me, at the Faith, at all who humiliated her. We can't be caught off guard." He stood, leaning on the windowsill. "We'll strengthen our watch. I'll speak with our allies among the gold cloaks. If she tries to return with force, we'll have a shield in place." She nodded, grateful for his support. "Yes, we must also reassure the High Sparrow that we stand firm. We cannot let him think we're weak or uncertain." In the days that followed, no sign of Cersei materialized. Ravens to Casterly Rock went unanswered, or else Kevin Lannister denied all knowledge of her whereabouts. Jaime remained somewhere in the Riverlands on a mission of truce. Rumors abounded, but no truth was found. Quietly, Margaery prepared for the worst, all the while maintaining her facade of a caring, gentle queen who only wished for the realm's prosperity. She informed the Faith that she would donate more gold to the poor, to show that the crown still remained in good standing with the Seven. The High Sparrow thanked her, cautioning that gold alone cannot cleanse the realm. She nodded, offering a bow of the head, playing the role expected of her. On the 6th day after Cersei's flight, Margaery stood again on the balcony of the Great September, looking out over King's Landing. This time, the sky was a startling blue, the sun bright, as though mocking the tension that gripped her. She recalled how she once stood here at dawn, the city hushed beneath the golden light. The hush now was one of anticipation, a taut breath before the storm. She felt the presence of the High Sparrow before she heard his voice. He approached with the slow, deliberate steps she had come to recognize. "Your Grace," he said, "I wish to speak with you regarding the Queen Mother." She turned. "I wish there was more I could say. She has vanished, and I know not where. My men have searched, but to no avail." His lined face was impassive. "There is a restlessness among the faithful. They see in her flight a rejection of penance. Some call for her head." Margaery's eyes flicked down. "The king is but a boy, and he loves his mother. I fear for his happiness should something drastic befall her. I would rather she surrender herself to the faith's judgment than be hunted down." He inclined his head. "A merciful sentiment, Queen Margaery. The people see your mercy and are moved by it. They do not wish for more bloodshed, but they crave justice." She folded her arms lightly, as though chilled by the wind. "If she refuses to return to face her sins, the faith must do what it deems necessary. I only ask that you proceed cautiously, for the sake of Tommen's peace." He paused, measuring her words. "Very well. We shall continue to search discreetly. Perhaps she will see reason and give herself up. If not, we must ensure that an enemy of the faith cannot gather enemies to the throne." Margaery gave a thoughtful nod. "Thank you, Holiness." He lingered a moment, then spoke softly. "You have proven yourself a wise and compassionate queen. The faith is grateful that you understand the necessity of moral law. But be ever vigilant. Evil does not rest." "I will, Holiness." He withdrew, leaving Margaery alone on the balcony, her mind spinning once more. Evil does not rest, she thought to herself. And in this city, it wears many faces. She gazed upon King's Landing, the labyrinth of streets, the patched roofs. Somewhere out there, perhaps in a dingy tavern or the secret basement of a merchant's house, was a woman who once ruled as Queen Mother. Wounded pride and hatred smoldered in her heart. Margaery pictured Cersei's eyes, how they burned with vengeance. She pictured all the possible alliances she might forge with those who opposed the faith's harsh discipline. This new era Margaery had helped create was tenuous indeed. She had allied with the High Sparrow to secure her family's place, to save her brother, to ensure she would not be devoured by the Lannister lion. In doing so, she had unleashed the faith's moral fervor upon the city. She had humiliated Cersei, removed her from power, and now the wave of consequence was upon them. Perhaps it would break gently upon the shore, or perhaps it would sweep them all away. She turned back toward the Sept's interior. She would not falter. She had the love of the people, the support of House Tyrell, and the alliance of the faith. Tommen was hers to guide. Cersei had lost nearly everything, so thoroughly outplayed by Margaery's quick arrangement with the High Sparrow. Yet she could not shake the feeling that a final confrontation was on the horizon. Winter was near. The realm quaked with hidden fault lines. If the lioness gathered enough strength, she might roar again, and if she returned with fire and blood, the faith militant and Margaery herself would have to stand firm. Margaery inhaled a deep breath of the scented air that drifted up from the city below, the faint aroma of spice from the street vendors, the salt of the sea, the dusty haze of sun-baked roads. She would meet whatever came next with the same calm resolve. She remembered her grandmother's words, "Beware a wounded lion." She whispered them to herself, feeling a chill in the warmth of day. Then she smiled, letting that chill pass. She was a rose of Highgarden, after all, and she had her own share of thorns. As she walked away from the balcony and into the shadowy grandeur of the Sept, she knew that the Game of Thrones was far from over. Her alliance with the High Sparrow had dealt a shattering blow to Cersei Lannister, but new perils would arise. For now, though, she would savor this moment of triumph. The city worshipped her, House Tyrell was ascendant, and the faith, for all its severity, had proven a steadfast partner in her cause. Margaery Tyrell had conspired with the High Sparrow before Cersei could react, and in doing so, she had ensured that the realm would change irrevocably. Whether that change heralded a lasting peace or a future conflagration remained to be seen, but she would shape the coming days with all the grace and cunning the Seven had bestowed upon her. And if Cersei ever returned, Margaery was ready. Margaery Tyrell walked away from the airy balcony of the Great September with the brisk, measured grace that had come to define her every move since she and the High Sparrow forged their understanding. Her pale violet gown, modest in its cut, swept across the polished stone as she made her way into the lanternlit halls, each footstep echoing in the hushed space. She suppressed the faint tremor of uncertainty that always came when she thought of Cersei Lannister's disappearance. The Queen Mother was a wounded lioness now, stripped of her pride by that merciless walk of atonement, her hair shorn and her name dragged through the streets. Yet it was precisely a wounded lion that might prove the most deadly, if given the chance. Margaery allowed the faintest sigh to leave her lips as she passed a series of slender pillars, the wind stirring the flames of the candles set upon each windowsill. Down the corridor, she saw two novices of the faith standing watch. One older, his head bowed in silent prayer, the other a young man who glanced up at her and dipped his chin reverently. Once, this would have been unusual in the royal sept, but now it was common to see the faith militant or novices observing the comings and goings of nobles, ensuring that all who walked these halls did so with proper humility. Margaery gave them both a warm smile, the picture of gentle piety, then slipped into a side cloister that led toward the small courtyard behind the September soft sunlight fell across the paving stones. A fountain bubbled in the center, half shaded by an ancient weirwood with scarlet leaves that rustled in the breeze. The hush here felt removed from the intrigues swirling beyond these walls. She took a seat on a stone bench, adjusting the drape of her gown. She had come here to gather herself before returning to the Red Keep. The city was in an unsettled state, its new moral regime balanced precariously between admiration for the High Sparrow's uprightness and a mounting fear that the faith's power might soon restrict their freedoms even further. Margaery was at once the beloved queen, showered with praise for her generosity and mildness, and a behind-the-scenes architect of the faith's rise, which had toppled the proud Lannisters. She felt the weight of that duality now. Even though the game of power had led her to victory over Cersei, the cost and the risk remained high. Shutting her eyes, she let the gentle sound of the fountain lull her momentarily, working to center herself. When she rose, she walked back into the sept, the novices offering another low bow. She made her way to the front of the vast hall, where a handful of the faith militant were quietly lighting candles. Several wealthy merchants and lesser lords were kneeling in prayer, heads bent. Margaery recognized a few: Lord Oscary, who had once supported the Lannisters but now bent the knee to whichever power held sway in the city, and a distant cousin of Rosby, wearing a crest that looked newly embroidered with the seven-pointed star. The city's elite sought to prove their devoutness in this climate, if only to avoid the faith's scrutiny. Outside, a carriage waited to return her to the Red Keep. The streets thrummed with daytime business, but there was a new orderliness to the traffic, courtesy of the faith's foot patrols and the gold cloaks who had learned to cooperate with them. As she traveled, Margaery gazed through the carriage window. She passed the statue of Baelor the Blessed, towering above the crowds. Vendors hawked fruit and bread, though with less brazenness than before, fearful perhaps that the faith might frown upon high prices or dishonest scales. A group of children ran across the cobbles, calling out to one another, and Margaery saw that they stopped to bow hurriedly as they recognized the royal carriage. She gave a small wave, hoping the glimpses of her face might reassure them that their queen was not a figure to fear. The carriage continued onward, rolling up the broad slope that led to the Red Keep's main gate. Once inside the keep, Margaery stepped down with the aid of a footman. She moved past the courtyard and into the castle corridors, where a hush met her. So many courtiers scurried about their business these days with a taut expression, as though uncertain which faction might accuse them next. As she glided toward her personal chambers, she caught sight of Pycelle's stooped form drifting by, nearly colliding with a marble pillar. The old Grand Maester offered her a fussy bow, but his watery eyes were filled with unease. He was one of the last vestiges of an older regime, once thoroughly aligned with the Lannisters. Now he tried to keep his head down, no doubt worried that the faith might call him to account for some half-forgotten sin. Margaery glided past him, offering the barest polite nod. Within her chambers, she found her brother Loras waiting, dressed in a simple, dark green doublet and trousers. Although the Knight of Flowers was more subdued now, a mark of tension still carved itself into his features. He turned from the window as she entered, his voice low and soft. "Have you heard anything of Cersei yet?" he asked. "Nothing new," Margaery replied. "The riders have gone out on every major road, and the gold cloaks keep watch on smaller byways. The faith's novices question travelers. Still, she remains a phantom. If she's still within the Crownlands, she must have found shelter in some out-of-the-way holdfast. Or perhaps she managed to slip out to the west. Kevin Lannister denies receiving her, but I trust nothing from him entirely. She might go to Jaime," Loras said. "But last we heard, he was entrenched near Riverrun, dealing with the Blackfish and the Tully remnants. Even if she reached him, how could she hope to raise enough strength to threaten the city? She might rely on cunning rather than open war," Margaery murmured. "Cersei has never been shy about more devious methods. Perhaps she seeks to bribe some discontented lords, or sow chaos. The city has not forgotten her downfall, but it takes only a handful of cunning moves to spark rebellion." Loras studied her for a moment. "You sound almost worried for the city." "I am worried," Margaery said, stepping toward her brother. The mid-morning light streamed through the window, catching flecks of gold in her hair. "If Cersei manages to build alliances with those who chafe under the faith's moral strictures, we could have unrest. The faith militant has done some good, but they can be heavy-handed. Right now, the small folk love me, or at least they love the image I present. But if taxation or religious zeal becomes too oppressive, that love can shift. One rumor about me, one whisper that I manipulate the High Sparrow for my own ends, and the faith might see me as another proud sinner to be brought low." Loras reached out and touched her arm gently. "You've managed this precarious balance perfectly so far, sister. You've saved me from that cell, you've delivered the city from Cersei's conspiracies, and you've kept Tommen's throne secure. House Tyrell has never stood stronger." "I've done what must be done," Margaery said, her tone quiet. "But if I learned anything from Olenna, it's that the slightest misstep in King's Landing can undo months of carefully laid plans. I must remain vigilant. So must you." He nodded, though a flicker of pain crossed his face. "I wish we could simply go home," he said softly. "Sometimes I dream of Highgarden, the fields of golden roses, the rolling hills, the Mander glinting under the sun. I dream of leaving all this behind." Her gaze softened. "In time, dear brother, I too miss it, but for now we must secure the future here in King's Landing. The moment we show weakness, vultures will circle. If I left Tommen unprotected, if I abandoned the court, some other force would swoop in to mold him into a puppet." Loras nodded again, more firmly this time. "Understood. I'll speak with Ser Talland and the other Tyrell retainers, make certain our men stay on alert. Also, the High Sparrow asked me to take part in distributing alms to the poor on the morrow near Flea Bottom. He seems eager to have the Knight of Flowers show humility, to illustrate that no one is too proud to serve the lowborn." Margaery managed a small smile. "He wants you as a symbol of virtue. That is the price for your freedom, obedience to the faith. Go, distribute alms, show them your gracious heart. It will only strengthen the Tyrell image among the small folk. It will remind them that we do not fear the poor or the devout." He bowed his head. "Very well." She released a soft breath as he departed, a swirl of tension lingering in the air behind him. The bond between her and her brother had always been close, but the events of the past months had changed them both. Loras had once been carefree, a brilliant knight who loved the pageantry of tournaments and the thrill of jousting. Now he was subdued, uncertain of himself, still bearing the emotional scars of his imprisonment. In turn, Margaery had sharpened the edges of her political mind. Her grandmother's teaching had guided her in the art of subtlety, but no lesson could fully prepare one for the intimate brutality of King's Landing. She gazed about her chambers, where the golden light and the drifting scent of lavender from a vase could not fully mask the apprehension that had rooted itself in her soul. A knock on the door startled her. One of her ladies stepped in, curtsying. "Your Grace," the young woman said softly, "the High Sparrow has arrived at the keep. He requests a brief audience with you in the Queen's solar." Margaery nodded and followed the lady through a series of halls until she reached the solar, once richly decorated, now made simpler, with fewer gaudy trappings. This had been at Margaery's own direction, a reflection of the humility she wore like a cloak. Beneath that cloak, she concealed a will of steel. As she entered, she found the High Sparrow examining one of the newly hung tapestries, which depicted scenes of saints guiding the faithful. She lowered her head in greeting. "Your Holiness," she said, letting a note of warmth enter her voice. "Welcome." He turned, staff clasped in one hand, wearing his usual rough-spun robes and unassuming sandals. His kindly face bore lines of both compassion and unyielding resolve. "Your Grace," he replied, voice soft, "I hope I do not intrude. The keep can be a place of endless duties." "You are never an intrusion," Margaery said. She glanced toward the servants, who hovered uncertainly by the door, and gave a small nod, dismissing them to a polite distance. "What brings you here this day, Holiness?" He studied her for a moment, as though weighing his words. "I come with news as well as a request. First, the news. The Faith has received word that Queen Mother Cersei Lannister may be hiding somewhere north of the Blackwater. A traveling septon claims to have seen a highborn lady on the roads, dressed in a hooded cloak, accompanied by a single companion. They changed horses at a wayside inn but left no name." Margaery held herself still, ensuring no flicker of alarm betrayed her. "That is more than we have gleaned so far." He nodded gravely. "We are dispatching additional faithful to investigate. If it is truly her, we must see that she does not rally other sinners to her cause. And now for the request. I would have you appear publicly at the Great September this next 7-day, during a special sermon on the virtues of humility. You would stand at my side, as a symbol of the crown's devotion. The city looks to you for guidance, now more than ever." Margaery inclined her head in acquiescence. "Of course, I would be honored to stand with you and reaffirm the crown's commitment to the Seven." He bowed his head, though his eyes glimmered with quiet intensity. "This city thrives when its rulers reflect the virtues we hold dear. The new laws we have introduced, penalties for prostitution, for lechery, for blasphemy, are meant to cleanse King's Landing of corruption. Yet some among the nobility grow restless. They whisper that the faith has grown too harsh." She folded her hands. "I have heard such whispers as well. But I assure you, I remain steadfast in support of any measures that safeguard the people from exploitation and vice." His gaze turned searching, and for a moment, Margaery found herself remembering how his intuition had cut through Cersei's lies. "You do realize, child, that there will always be those who prefer the old ways of indulgence," he said gently. "They will test us. Should one among the royal household stray from the path of righteousness, the faith would be forced to act." She kept her spine straight, her expression serene. "I understand, Holiness." She allowed a subtle current of steel to underlie her tone, as if to say she did not fear such a prospect. "I am certain none in the royal household will stray." He gave the faintest inclination of his chin. "I take comfort in your piety, my queen." With that, he turned and left, staff tapping softly on the floor. Margaery stood alone in the solar, the embroidered tapestry behind her depicting saintly figures. She breathed in slowly, acknowledging the underlying warning in his words. The faith was watchful, always. Cersei's fall had been a demonstration that no one, not even a king's mother, was safe from the Seven's judgment. She had cooperated with the High Sparrow to bring Cersei low, but that same power could threaten her if she ever showed herself to be a hypocrite or a rival. Well, so be it, she told herself. She had not survived this far by underestimating her allies or her enemies. By that evening, the news of Cersei's supposed sighting had spread through the upper echelons of King's Landing. Talk bubbled at the edges of every feast, every corridor, overshadowing the usual court gossip. Some insisted that the Queen Mother had sought refuge in a remote holdfast, others that she was on her way to the Westerlands, where Kevin Lannister would protect her. Margaery convened a small gathering of her most trusted Tyrell supporters, Ser Talland, Lady Alice Beesbury, Lord Caswell of Bitterbridge, to discuss the possibility of an impending Lannister power play. They sat around a table in a private salon, the door heavily guarded. Lady Alice twisted the ring on her finger nervously. If Cersei raises any kind of force, it would take at least a moon's turn to march upon King's Landing. The roads are muddy, and the local lords might not be eager to feed an army of exiles. Ser Talland, his square jaw tight, grunted. The worry is less about an army in the open, more about sabotage. A cunning hand could spark riots in the city, bribe the gold cloaks, or set the faith militant at odds with the crown. All it takes is the right rumor, the right moment. Margaery nodded, resting her gaze on each in turn. We will counter any rumor with swift, public gestures of unity between the crown and the faith. Let them see Tommen at prayer, see me standing beside the High Sparrow. If Cersei tries to claim that the Tyrells and the faith are oppressing the realm, we must show the people that we act only out of love for the Seven and the realm's welfare. Lord Caswell fidgeted with the edge of his cloak. Yet there is no denying that the faith has been firm. The licensing fees for merchants in certain trades, the crackdown on certain entertainments. Some say it is too much. Margaery allowed a thin smile. I will speak to the High Sparrow to see if we might ease some restrictions, at least to reduce the volume of complaints. A queen must be a voice of temperance, after all. The small folk should not come to resent the faith. And we do not want them blaming House Tyrell either, should coin grow scarce. The plan was set in motion. Margaery indeed visited the High Sparrow the following morning, raising the concern that some of the new regulations might be driving honest merchants out of business. She couched it in terms of compassion, suggesting that the Seven would not want families starving because of overly harsh rules. The High Sparrow listened gravely and agreed to convene a council of the devout to consider moderation in certain lesser edicts, like small entertainment permits and merchant fees, while retaining the harsher penalties for overt sins. Margaery recognized this as a subtle victory, for it allowed her to appear as a benevolent mediator in the eyes of the city. A few days later, as she walked the keep's outer courtyard in the pale morning sun, she felt a semblance of calm. Progress was slow but real. Loras, fulfilling his vow of service, had distributed bread and coins in Flea Bottom, a gesture that won applause from the needy. House Tyrell's name shone brighter for it. When he returned, footsore and fatigued, he admitted that the experience had been surprisingly uplifting. They see me differently now, he murmured. Not just some pampered knight, but a man offering real help. Margaery was proud of him, though she noticed that the old spark in his eyes had not fully returned. This city took its toll on them all, and Loras was not the carefree champion of the lists he had once been. But at least he was forging a new sense of purpose. She embraced him, murmuring gratitude for his steadfastness. The faith would have no cause to doubt his sincerity. That very afternoon, however, a messenger brought a disturbing update. Lady Tanda Stokeworth, a lady known to have once been close to the Lannisters, had abruptly left the city under the excuse of visiting a sick cousin. Witnesses reported seeing her gather carts of provisions and gold, departing through the mud gate with an unusual number of guards. Margaery felt a coil of worry unravel in her stomach. Tanda Stokeworth had never been a particularly formidable figure, but she was known for her endless loyalty to any Lannister in power. If she had decided to ride out, perhaps she intended to bring support to Cersei. Margaery conferred with Loras and Ser Talland. They agreed to dispatch a few Tyrell outriders to discreetly follow Tanda's party if possible, to see if they might track her destination. The game was shifting again, the pieces moving across a board that stretched far beyond the city walls. The High Sparrow was informed, and he sent a pair of the Faith militant to look into it as well. Margaery did not want them interfering too directly. Too much meddling by the Faith outside the city might only inflame lords who already resented that order's reach, but she recognized the necessity. Cersei's flight was a wound to the Faith's sense of infallibility. They would act swiftly to recapture or contain her. Late that evening, as the castle sank into the quiet of torchlit corridors, Margaery sat in her favorite chair by the window of her private chamber, sipping a cup of mulled wine. She turned the events over in her mind, trying to see them through. Cersei's eyes. Could Tanda Stokeworth's flight truly be at Cersei's urging? It would make sense for Cersei to gather allies among the lesser lords who still feared the High Sparrow's fervor. She could promise them a return to the old order, fewer religious strictures, and the restoration of Lannister gold for their loyalty. The question was, how many would heed that call? She set her wine aside and rose to slip out onto the small balcony. The night air was cool. From this vantage, she could see the faint glimmer of lanterns along the city walls and the calmer darkness of Blackwater Bay beyond. The surge of the tide was just audible, a rhythmic hush. Closing her eyes, she allowed a moment of reflection, thinking of what it had cost to get here. She had sacrificed her ease, her illusions of safety. She had bartered away secrets to the High Sparrow, orchestrating Cersei's downfall. She had risked everything for House Tyrell's position, and so far it had worked. The crown was hers in all but name, shared with a gentle boy-king who looked to her for guidance. She found her thoughts drifting to Tommen. The child had been so distraught over his mother's humiliation, and now her disappearance left him clinging to Margaery more than ever. She knew he worried, in his boyish way, that Cersei might be suffering or in danger. Margaery walked a fine line, comforting him while not encouraging any illusions that might lead him to defy the Faith. She recognized she held a crucial piece of his heart now, and she had to guard it, for his sake and for the realm's. She prayed silently that she was strong enough to be both caretaker and queen. In the days that followed, Tanda Stokeworth's trail went cold. The Tyrell outriders reported losing her near a fork in the road that could lead northeast toward Harrenhal or southwest toward Casterly Rock. Tracks had been obscured, suggesting she might have planned her route carefully. Meanwhile, the city was abuzz with speculation. Margaery, maintaining composure, redoubled her public appearances. She visited the orphanages the Faith had established, blessing the children and distributing small trinkets. She attended the High Sparrow's sermon at the Great September, standing beside him while he preached on the virtues of unity and the perils of discord. Dressed in a simple gown of ivory with silver trim, her hair half covered by a sheer veil, she listened intently as he spoke, letting the crowd see her as the model of devout queenship. Tommen, perched near her, fidgeted but followed her lead. She gave his hand a reassuring squeeze whenever he looked fearful or bored. That evening, a hush fell over the court when word arrived that the High Sparrow had arrested 2 minor Lannister cousins, reported to have attempted flight in the night. They were discovered carrying sealed letters apparently addressed to Casterly Rock, though no one yet knew the contents. Margaery suppressed a twinge of concern. The Faith was tightening its grip again, determined to root out any Lannister sympathizers. She could not object too strongly, lest she appear to defend them, but she could not wholly approve such measures either, for fear that the Faith's crackdown might drive more lords into Cersei's arms. She met privately with the High Sparrow in the same small chamber where they had once brokered their alliance. A single candle burned on a narrow table, throwing dancing shadows against the walls. He read her expression as she entered, and for the first time, she sensed a hint of tension on his usually calm features. "Your Grace," he said, "the Faith's hand is forced. These Lannister cousins sought to conspire with the Queen Mother. If we do not deter such behavior, we risk allowing sin and treachery to fester." Margaery clasped her hands before her, adopting the gentle air that so often served her. "I understand your position, Holiness, yet I worry that arresting anyone who might hold Lannister loyalty could spread fear and resentment among those who remain neutral. We must guide them toward the Seven, not drive them away." He inclined his head. "Wise words, child, but we must not let them imagine we are weak, or that the faith can be flouted with impunity. My hope is that through a firm stance, we will deter others from following Cersei. Let them see that the path of rebellion leads only to a cell. Margaery nodded slowly, letting silence lengthen. Finally, she spoke. I only ask that you show mercy where you can. If these cousins are young and frightened, perhaps they can be allowed to atone through a penance rather than severe punishment. If they have done no real harm yet, we might show clemency. His lips curved into a faint smile. Your compassion is a gift. I will consider it. In return, I ask that you remain steadfast in your public support for the faith's mission. Show the people that the crown stands with us. We must speak with one voice. She dipped her head. We do, Holiness. They parted on cordial terms. Yet as Margaery returned to her chambers, she felt the constant balancing act weigh upon her heart. She had to maintain the faith's good graces while preventing them from becoming so tyrannical that the realm rebelled. And all the while, Cersei lurked somewhere in the shadows, a threat not yet realized. Over the next few weeks, another complication arose. Envoys from Dorne arrived in the city, led by a solemn courtier who claimed to represent Prince Trystane Martell's interests, though rumor held that Prince Trystane was effectively a prisoner in his own land, with Ellaria Sand and her daughters having seized control. No official word had reached King's Landing about Prince Doran's final days, but the situation in Dorne was murky at best, with many believing the Martell line was compromised. The envoy brought with him a request for renewed trade agreements, but there was an undercurrent of tension in every word he spoke. Margaery received him in the throne room, seated at Tommen's side. The young king struggled to project authority, stammering as he attempted to greet the envoy, so Margaery smoothly took over. She welcomed the Dornishman with warmth, praising Dorne's vibrant culture and expressing hope for continued peace. He expressed polite reciprocation, but Margaery could see that he measured every phrase. She invited him to a private audience later, hoping to glean more about the state of the southernmost kingdom. When that meeting occurred, however, the envoy offered only vague remarks, refusing to confirm or deny rumors of unrest. Instead, he redirected the discussion toward the faith's increasing power. With a light smile, he asked if Dorne could expect the same pious oversight if Dornish traders began ferrying goods into King's Landing. Margaery, sensing the subtext, assured him that honest merchants would be welcomed. She concealed her unease, for it was clear even outsiders saw the faith's influence as overshadowing Tommen's. After the envoy departed, Margaery found herself pacing the solar, the embroidered Tyrell roses seeming to swirl on her gown. The city's air felt heavy, as if suffused with the knowledge that everyone was waiting for some blow to fall. Where was Cersei? Had she allied with the Stormlands, the Vale, the Riverlands? Margaery felt certain that if the Queen Mother truly intended to strike back, she was taking her time to secure a formidable plan. A moon's turn passed with no direct sign of Cersei. The High Sparrow's men continued to arrest minor Lannister loyalists, subjecting them to questioning. Most were released after confessions or penances, while a few were sentenced to public lashings or longer imprisonment. Kevin Lannister wrote to the Crown, expressing outrage that his kin should be treated so severely, but he offered no admission that Cersei had contacted him. Jaime remained absent, still managing tensions in the Riverlands. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Tommen was crowned anew in a ceremony highlighting his devotion to the Seven, with Margaery at his side. The High Sparrow gave a stirring sermon about the blessings of a pious king, and the people seemed genuinely cheered to see Tommen, boyish and earnest, publicly reaffirming that he and his queen would guide them toward a righteous future. But as Margaery soon learned, beneath every surface existed a crack. Late one night, Loras came to her chambers with an anxious expression. He reported that Ser Talon's outriders had returned with disturbing tales. Small gatherings of armed men, calling themselves the Faith's foes, had been spotted in the countryside north of the Blackwater. They wore no sigils but spoke openly of resisting the zealots in King's Landing. The rumor was that they had coin from some hidden sponsor. Margaery's blood chilled. She suspected Cersei's hand in this. If she had found a way to fund these bands of rebels, they could harass supply routes into the city, strain the Faith's ability to keep order. Already, she imagined the High Sparrow's stern response. He would doubtless send the Faith militant to hunt them down, which could spark open violence. She paced the length of her chamber, the candles guttering at the late hour. Loras leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "We could offer to send the gold cloaks out in force," he said, "or dispatch Tyrell men. But if the Faith insists on leading the charge, we'll look like we're deferring to them again. Meanwhile, if the rumors spread that these rebels are simply families trying to keep the Faith from interfering in their villages, we could face a wave of sympathy for them." Margaery raked a hand gently through her hair. "We must handle this delicately. I'll speak to Tommen and have him announce that these roving bands threaten the crown's peace, not merely the Faith. That way it won't appear as though it's a purely religious crackdown. The city must see that we are preserving law and order, and will ensure any conflict is framed as an attack on the king, not on the Faith." Her gaze found the flicker of the candle's flame. "Still, we need more information," she said quietly. "I want to know who truly leads these rebels. If they have no direct knowledge of Cersei, or if they're merely inspired by discontent, we might defuse them with an offer of amnesty or lighter enforcement. But if Cersei has planted her gold among them, then they are a threat that cannot be lightly dismissed." The next day, Margaery confided in the High Sparrow that she had heard rumors of brigands in the north, stirring trouble. He responded with zeal, insisting that the Faith militant would root them out. Margaery then skillfully pivoted the conversation, suggesting that if these outlaws were indeed misguided smallfolk, perhaps a royal envoy could be dispatched to hear their grievances. "If we demonstrate our willingness to listen to their concerns," she told him, "we might bring them back into the Seven's light without bloodshed." He studied her with that discerning gaze, then nodded slowly. "You speak of mercy. Yes, the Seven often commend mercy when the sinner is ignorant, not willfully corrupt. But let it be known, if they refuse that mercy and raise arms against the Faith, we will be forced to show them the error of their ways." She inclined her head. "Of course, Holiness." For the next week, the city held its breath, waiting to see what would happen. Margaery oversaw the dispatch of a small group of gold cloaks and Tyrell men, ostensibly led by a low-level royal official, to the villages where the rebels had been sighted. They carried instructions to offer leniency if these so-called Faith's foes would swear loyalty to King Tommen. Meanwhile, the Faith militant readied themselves for a harsher campaign if diplomacy failed. Margaery tried to calm Tommen's fears, telling him that everything was well in hand. The boy looked up at her with trusting eyes, clinging to her every word. Then came the day the envoys returned. They brought unsettling news. In 2 villages, the so-called rebels had melted away rather than face confrontation. But in a third, a group of armed men confronted the envoys openly. They wore no sigil, though one man openly boasted that they had the blessing of powerful friends. The envoys claimed the men refused to bend the knee unless the false clergy in King's Landing stepped down. When pressed on who their benefactors were, they only smiled bitterly and said, "We fight for the real queen." The real queen. Margaery needed no further hint. Cersei's hand was evident in their defiance. And though these men were small in number now, they represented a spark of something larger. If left unchecked, that spark could ignite rebellion across the Crownlands. She spent the evening in council with the High Sparrow, Loras, and several advisors. Tempers flared among some of the Faith militant, who wanted immediate, forceful action. Others urged caution, warning that if the Faith marched into the countryside, it could unify the rebels behind a single banner of resistance. At last, it was agreed that a larger group of gold cloaks, bolstered by a small retinue of Tyrell knights, would be dispatched to protect vital roads and farmland. If confronted by rebels, they would attempt negotiation, but were authorized to defend themselves. Loras volunteered to help lead this group, perhaps eager to prove his mettle and repay the Faith for his freedom. Margaery hesitated. She did not wish to risk her brother's life, yet she recognized that Loras might impress the people if he rode out as a champion of peace. She ultimately agreed, on the condition that he proceed with caution and remain in close communication with the city. She saw him off one crisp morning, where he sat astride a fine courser, wearing a light breastplate etched with the Tyrell rose and the seven-pointed star. The gold cloaks lined up behind him, along with a handful of knights. Margaery stood in the courtyard, ensuring the departure was a public affair. The faith's novices looked on approvingly as she blessed the small force in the name of the Seven. She was sure word would spread throughout King's Landing. Ser Loras Tyrell, devout and penitent, leading a band to restore the king's peace. It was precisely the narrative she hoped to project. But she could not ignore the knot of anxiety in her chest as Loras rode out of sight. This was a dangerous step. If the rebels proved well organized, or if Cersei herself lurked out there somewhere, Loras could be ambushed. Yet she had no choice. If she kept her brother locked away in safety forever, neither the faith nor the realm would respect him. He had to face real challenges if he was to reclaim a measure of his old confidence. As the days slipped by, Margaery continued her duties at court. She met with merchants petitioning for relaxed trade rules, while the High Sparrow oversaw a public forum on moral conduct in the streets. Tommen dutifully held audiences, though it was clear to all who truly governed. The Tyrell Guard discreetly controlled access to the king, ensuring no Lannister plot could reach him unexpectedly. Margaery found a steady routine, speaking softly to Tommen each morning, guiding him through each decision, then performing her public appearances and behind-the-scenes negotiations to keep the city stable. An uneventful fortnight passed, leaving Margaery anxious for word from Loras. Then, at last, a courier arrived one damp evening, clothing spattered in mud, bearing a letter sealed with the Tyrell rose. Margaery read it in private. Loras's missive described traveling through the Crownlands, meeting frightened peasants who claimed that men in black hoods sometimes raided their barns at night, stealing grain. A few local knights had turned up dead under mysterious circumstances. In one hamlet, Loras's men found scrawled messages on a wall, proclaiming, "The lion will roar again." But despite these threats, the rebels had not yet confronted him directly. Loras wrote that he planned to push deeper into a forested region rumored to shelter outlaws. Margaery's heart pounded at the risk, but she understood he had to do it if they were to quell the unrest. She penned a swift reply, urging him to proceed with all caution, reminding him to rely on negotiation wherever possible, but granting him leeway to act in the king's name if negotiations failed. With the city growing increasingly uneasy, Margaery endeavored to maintain a calm front. She organized a small feast in honor of the harvest, inviting loyal lords and a smattering of merchants. The High Sparrow declined to attend the feast portion, though he agreed to bless the harvest in the Great September earlier that day. Margaery took that opportunity to make a show of devotion, kneeling before the altar, asking for the Seven's guidance to protect the people from outlaws. The assembled nobility watched, murmuring approval, and the small folk who managed to slip in gazed at her with admiration. She could hear them whisper that their queen was pious and kind, that she truly cared for their plight. She kept the subsequent feast modest, a reflection of the city's new sensibilities, but still elegant enough to impress her guests. She spoke graciously of unity under King Tommen and repeated her faith in the High Sparrow's moral leadership. A few lords eyed her with skepticism or fear, but none dared speak openly against the faith in that setting. It was an evening of masks, everyone smiling and bowing, though hidden tensions pulsed like an undertow. Late that night, after the guests had departed and torches were burning low in the hall, Margaery retreated to her bedchamber, exhaustion tugging at her limbs. She dismissed her remaining ladies, slipping out of her gown with an almost weary sigh, then donned a simpler robe. She was about to sink onto a cushioned chair when a quiet knock startled her. Ser Talon stepped in, features set in a grim line. "Your Grace, I apologize for disturbing you at this hour," he said in a hushed tone. "But we have urgent tidings from the West Gate. A group of riders returned Loras's men, and they bear wounded. They say there's been bloodshed." Fear slammed into her chest. She pulled a cloak over her robe and followed Ser Talon into the corridors, moving quickly. Servants scurried aside, wide-eyed. They made their way to the courtyard near the stables, where flickering torches revealed a grim tableau. A handful of dusty, battered riders dismounting, several assisting a comrade slumped with blood staining his armor. The acrid scent of sweat, steel, and copper lingered in the air. Margaery hurried forward, heart pounding. "Where is Loras?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. A knight with a battered helm bowed his head. "We became separated, Your Grace. We were ambushed in the woods near a place called Drillog Hill. At first, we thought them only a few brigands, but more came out of hiding. They had crossbows and wore black cloaks. Ser Loras ordered us to break through and rally, but in the chaos, some of us got separated. We fought our way free, but Ser Loras was still engaged with the main force. We lost sight of him." A chill scoured Margaery's veins. "You abandoned him?" she asked sharply, though she tried to keep her tone even. The knight shook his head, shame in his eyes. "We had wounded, and the crossbow bolts were raining upon us. We tried to circle back, but we were cut off. Ser Loras shouted for us to save the injured, said he'd hold them off. He had maybe a dozen men with him. We don't know if he escaped." Margaery's stomach turned. She looked to Ser Talland, who wore a grim expression. "We must send out more men at once," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We'll form a rescue party with fresh horses and bring them to that forest. If he's captor, and we must secure his release. If he's still fighting, we must save him." Ser Talland bowed, already summoning the guards around him. "I'll lead them myself, Your Grace." Within the hour, a rescue party of 36 mounted fighters, half gold cloaks and half Tyrell knights, was ready to ride. Talland led them out of the castle gates, lanterns bobbing in the darkness. Margaery stood on the ramparts, biting her lip, praying to the Seven that they would find Loras alive. Tension coiled so fiercely in her that her fingers trembled against the cold stone. She slept little that night, waiting for dawn with a pounding heart. When the first glimmers of morning light crept into the sky, she remained in her chambers, having told her ladies to let her be. Her mind spun scenarios, Loras dead or gravely wounded or worse, taken prisoner by men who might deliver him to Cersei. Every time her imagination conjured such images, she forced herself to think of him alive, battered but breathing, defiantly holding his sword. Dawn turned to midday, and no word arrived. By afternoon, she paced in a near frenzy. A single day was not long for a rescue party traveling some distance, but every moment of waiting was agony. That evening, a sentry hurried to inform her that riders approached. Margaery rushed to the courtyard again, heart hammering. She arrived as Ser Talland and his men dismounted under the wavering glow of torches. She scanned their numbers anxiously. First, she could not see Loras. Then, Talland helped a slumped form down from a horse. Margaery's breath caught. It was Loras, pale and unconscious, an arrow still lodged in his side, dark stains spattering his tunic. She ran to him, ignoring decorum. They laid him gently on a pallet. She knelt beside him, reaching for his hand. He stirred, moaning softly, but his eyes remained closed. "He's alive," Talland said, voice hushed. "We found them near a creek. Most of his men were dead. Loras had taken an arrow below his ribs and another in the thigh. He fought like a demon," they said, cutting down 3 outlaws before collapsing. "The enemy fled when we arrived. Looked like they'd lost their nerve." Margaery exhaled, tears trembling in her eyes. Thank the Seven. She turned to a cluster of servants, ordering them to carry Loras to a prepared bedchamber and fetch the best maester available. Over the next hour, the maester arrived, carefully extracting the arrow from Loras's side while Margaery waited just outside. She flinched at his cries when he regained partial consciousness, but it reassured her that he could still make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the maester emerged, wiping sweat from his brow. He confirmed that the wounds were grave but not beyond healing if infection did not set in. She spent that night by Loras's bedside, holding a linen cloth to his forehead, where fever began to rise. Each time his breath grew ragged, panic surged within her. This was her beloved brother, the shining knight who had once been the pride of Highgarden. Now he lay broken by an ambush orchestrated, she had no doubt, by Cersei's hidden allies. Rage simmered beneath her sorrow, and she murmured prayers to the Seven to spare him. As dawn came, she realized that if the Faith had needed a rallying cry to crush these outlaws, Loras's near-fatal wounding would surely provide it, and that might lead to open bloodshed. By midday, the High Sparrow came to see Loras, though he kept a respectful distance, conferring quietly with Margaery in a corner of the sick room. He showed genuine sympathy, but his eyes glinted with determination. "Ser Loras has risked his life to uphold the king's peace," he said softly. "If these outlaws indeed cry out for the lion's return, we must respond. The time for half measures is past. Let us send the Faith militant into those forests to scour them of this evil." Margaery pressed her lips together, grief and anger mingling in her voice. "I do not want an endless campaign of violence, Holiness. If the outlaws have lords behind them, we risk starting a war." He set a comforting hand on her arm. "War is sometimes necessary to root out sin. Cersei Lannister's flight has emboldened the faithless. If we do not act now, they will strike again, and more will bleed. I believe it is the will of the Seven that we confront them." She glanced at Loras's still form, feeling tears burn her eyes. Then she nodded slowly. "Very well, but I ask that you treat those who surrender with compassion. Spare the small folk forced into this fight. Let your wrath be reserved for those who orchestrated the ambush." He gave a solemn nod. "I will pray for guidance to show mercy where possible." The High Sparrow left, presumably to organize a sweep of the Crownlands with the Faith militant. Margaery felt a bitter taste in her mouth. She did not want the city plunged into a religious war, yet Cersei had left no choice. The ambush on Loras, an unmistakable sign that these rebels were serious, would not be ignored by the Faith. Unless Margaery could find some path of negotiation, blood would spill again, perhaps enough to draw the entire realm into chaos. She slipped back to Loras's bedside, wiping sweat from his brow. He was feverish, mumbling incoherent phrases. Every so often, he gripped her hand with surprising strength, as if seeking an anchor in the darkness. She squeezed back, tears trailing her cheeks. In that moment, she cared less about the throne or the Faith or the city, and more about her brother's life. Anger flared anew, directed at Cersei. Had she truly orchestrated this? Margaery had no proof, but it was too convenient to be coincidence. Tommen, pale-faced and anxious, tried to visit Loras that afternoon, but the sight of the knight's wounds unnerved him. He lingered awkwardly, tears in his eyes, then fled the room, muttering apologies. Margaery felt a pang of pity for the boy king. He was still so young. This realm's cruelty threatened to crush him if she did not hold him upright. In the days that followed, Loras's condition wavered. Fever gripped him, but the maester's potions seemed to fight it. He drifted in and out of consciousness, moaning at times, at others whispering Margaery's name. She rarely left him, trusting her ladies and a few Tyrell knights to manage the day-to-day tasks. The High Sparrow launched a campaign in the Crownlands, sending the Faith militant in groups of 10 and 20, searching for rebel strongholds. Reports arrived of skirmishes near Drillog Hill, with a dozen outlaws captured or killed. The rumor was that more outlaws retreated deeper into the wooded hills, scattering to avoid pitched battles. The Faith militant pressed on relentlessly, questioning peasants and burning any hideouts they found. Margaery feared it would soon escalate into a widespread purge if the rebels continued to resist. At last, after a torturous week, Loras's fever broke. She was at his side, dozing, when she felt his hand squeeze hers. His eyes opened, clouded but aware. "Margaery," he croaked. She gave a small, choked laugh of relief. "I'm here. You're safe now." He swallowed, wincing at the pain in his side. "The ambush. Someone warned them we'd come, or they planned it. They had crossbows. They aimed for me. I saw a banner, black cloth, with a gold lion stitched on the underside. They didn't display it openly, but I caught a glimpse." He coughed, trembling. She soothed him, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "It's all right. Rest. You've done enough." His voice shook. "She's behind this. I know she is." Margaery nodded, tears threatening again. "I know," she said softly. "We'll deal with her." He squeezed her hand once more, then slipped back into a tired slumber, but his breathing sounded steadier. She stared at him for a long while. She had her confirmation now. Cersei's hand was behind these attacks. The black cloak, the subtle sign of a lion. Cersei might be using stashes of Lannister gold to pay these men, or had arranged it through Tanda Stokeworth or other hidden loyalists. As Loras slowly improved, Margaery emerged from her vigil and summoned the courage to re-engage with the High Sparrow and the Council. She walked into the throne room one morning to find Tommen perched uncertainly on the Iron Throne, the High Sparrow advising him about the need for further deployments of the Faith Militant. A small cluster of nobles listened in uneasy silence. Margaery's entrance drew their attention, and she inclined her head in a queenly gesture. Then, softly and firmly, she addressed Tommen. "My king, I come with gratitude for the care you've shown my brother in his time of need. But I must also express my concern. The realm grows weary of bloodshed. If we push too hard, innocent small folk may be caught in the middle. We must be sure of our targets before we send more soldiers." Tommen looked relieved to hear her speak. He leaned forward slightly, glancing to the High Sparrow, then back to her. "I don't want the people to suffer," he said, his voice boyish but sincere. "But we must protect them from these traitors." She nodded, stepping closer. "True, my king. Let us send the Faith Militant with new orders to treat peasants gently and only punish those who bear arms against the crown. Let them gather intelligence rather than burn entire villages. We do not win hearts by fear alone. Show them that you are a merciful king." Tommen brightened, clinging to this idea. "Yes, exactly. A merciful king. The High Sparrow will surely agree that mercy is a virtue." The High Sparrow, standing at Tommen's side, inclined his head, though Margaery saw a flicker of reserve in his eyes. "Mercy is indeed a virtue," he said, "but justice is also required to prevent further harm. Still, if the king wishes for a more measured approach, we shall abide by it." Margaery smiled serenely. "Thank you, Holiness." She recognized that he might chafe under these constraints, but so long as Tommen voiced the order in public, the High Sparrow would have to comply or risk being seen as defying the king's expressed will. It was a small victory, one that might prevent the entire countryside from erupting into open revolt. The Faith would still hunt outlaws, but at least they would not slash and burn blindly. As the session concluded, Margaery felt a tug on her sleeve. Tommen beckoned her aside, childlike eagerness and anxiety mingling on his face. "Will Ser Loras recover?" he asked. "He was so brave to go out there. I wish I could do something to help him." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "He grows stronger each day, my love. He will heal, though it may take time. Your kindness in sending the best maester has already helped more than you know." Tommen nodded, then lowered his voice. "Mother always said the Tyrells were dangerous, but I don't believe that. You've only ever helped me, and now that she's gone, I feel safer with you. Is that terrible to say?" Her heart softened at his confession. She brushed a hand across his cheek. "Not terrible at all. Your mother loves you in her own way, but her choices were unfortunate. Perhaps in time she'll see reason. For now, we have each other, and we have the Seven to guide us." He exhaled, as though unburdened, and nodded. She smiled and escorted him out of the throne room. She was aware of the High Sparrow's gaze following them, thoughtful and unblinking. Let him watch, she thought. She intended no betrayal of the faith, but she would ensure Tommen never again fell under Cersei's malign influence. In the days that followed, tension hovered in the city like a storm cloud. The Faith Militant reported capturing several rebel pockets, while others vanished into hidden camps. Rumors abounded that a woman traveling under the name Lady Rickon had been seen distributing gold to peasants who swore to resist the tyranny of the September. But no one could confirm her identity. Margaery was sure it was Cersei, or at least one of her proxies, continuing to stoke the fires of resentment. She wrote letters to Kevin Lannister, demanding an explanation for these armed bands that claimed allegiance to the Lions. He responded with carefully worded denials, insisting he had no knowledge and that House Lannister did not condone any assault on the king's peace. Margaery believed him only insofar as he might not actively support Cersei's madness. Yet he would never betray her completely. With Loras on the mend, albeit slowly, Margaery found solace in his occasional moments of lucidity. He woke one afternoon to find her reading a book of chivalric tales at his bedside. She set it aside and smiled as he blinked up at her. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like I've been trampled by a warhorse," he croaked, but a shadow of a grin touched his lips. "Though I suppose I'm fortunate to be alive." She nodded, pressing her hand softly against his. "I'm so glad you're still with me," she whispered. "I was terrified I'd lose you." He squeezed her hand. "You won't lose me so easily. I remember bits of the ambush. The men in black cloaks. They shouted about a queen betrayed and a false king. I'm certain they meant Cersei. They said the faith was a tyranny. Margaery, be careful. They hate you as much as they hate the High Sparrow." She gave a small nod, brow creased. "I'll be careful, and I won't let their hatred stop me. This city depends on us now. We must weather the storm." He sighed, sinking back against the pillows. "Once I'm strong enough, I'll ride again. I won't let them think the Night of Flowers is so easily broken." She stroked his hand lightly. "Recover at your own pace. The realm needs you, yes, but in good health." He closed his eyes, exhaustion claiming him once more. Margaery sat by him quietly, her thoughts returning to how precarious their situation had become. The Faith's crackdown, Cersei's outlaws, and the boy king caught in the middle. A single spark could ignite a war that would devour them all. And if that happened, all her careful alliances would be for naught. She took solace in small victories. The High Sparrow's limited approach to the countryside, while still forceful, was not as brutal as it might have been. Some villages welcomed the Faith militant after they heard that the Queen herself wished for mercy. Others took a more cautious stance, but there was no widespread uprising yet. The roads into the city remained largely secure, and King's Landing, while tense, was not in open revolt. The small folk still revered Margaery for her kindness and generosity. Every time she walked the streets with a modest escort, they would call out blessings and thanks. As harvest season rolled into a chilly autumn, Margaery oversaw preparations for the winter stores. She coordinated with the granaries in the Reach to ensure shipments of grain continued. Though the presence of outlaws forced some shipments to travel with heavier guard, trade did not cease. She also quietly arranged for a portion of Tyrell gold to be funneled into small charitable works, giving bread and stew to the poorest of the poor. The High Sparrow observed and commended these efforts, praising the Queen's devotion. Margaery, in turn, used the praise to remind him that a content populace was less prone to sin. Their alliance continued, though she sensed an undercurrent of tension in him whenever the topic of further arrests arose. One crisp, windy evening, Margaery was in her solar, reading a letter from her grandmother, Olenna Tyrell. The letter was peppered with the Queen of Thorns' usual barbs and dry humor, chastising Mace Tyrell for his lack of political cunning, but reaffirming Olenna's support for Margaery's stewardship in King's Landing. Olenna promised to send more provisions if winter hit early, and she warned Margaery to watch for any sign that the Faith might overreach itself, for it was a hungry beast once unleashed. Margaery smiled wryly at that. She would not let the Faith consume the throne, no matter how pious its intent. She was nearly done reading when a frantic knock sounded at her door. A guard rushed in with eyes wide. "Your Grace, a group of travelers has just arrived at the postern gate. A woman claiming to be Lady Tanda Stokeworth. She looks ill, raving about an attack on the road." Margaery stood, heart quickening. "Where is she now?" "In the courtyard, my lady. She's demanding to speak with you, raving something about the Queen Mother." Margaery hastened out into the courtyard, accompanied by guards. She found Tanda Stokeworth being half supported, half carried by two of her servants. The lady's gown was torn, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. Her hair stuck to her brow in damp strands. Her eyes widened at the sight of Margaery, and she staggered forward, nearly falling to her knees. "Your Grace," Tanda gasped. "I beg you, forgive me. I was a fool." Margaery reached out, steadying her. "My lady, you're safe now. What happened?" She gestured for servants to bring water or wine. Tanda swallowed painfully. I rode out to find Queen Mother Cersei, as she commanded me, to offer her my support. She had some of my kinsmen in her power. She threatened me if I refused. I was to deliver gold and provisions to a camp in the Crownlands. But once I arrived, her men, those outlaws, took the gold and laughed at me. Then they threatened to kill me if I did not swear to raise an army of my own. I fled in the night. They pursued. I escaped only by fortune. They shot arrows at my carriage. My poor driver is dead." She dissolved into sobs, trembling violently. Margaery exchanged a glance with her guards, who wore grim expressions. She knelt beside Tanda, touching her shoulder gently. "You've done right to come back. You will be safe here. We will see that you receive healing and rest." Tanda choked on another sob. "Cersei is mad. She's given herself over to vengeance. She told me the realm would burn before she let a Tyrell queen rule her son. She hates you, your grace. She hates the faith. She said the High Sparrow has to die. I wanted no part of it, but I was trapped." Margaery pursed her lips. So it was all but confirmed. Cersei was rallying what forces she could, using intimidation and violence to coerce once loyal courtiers. Tanda's ragged state was evidence enough of how dire it had grown. Margaery beckoned a maid. "Take Lady Tanda to the maesters. Give her a warm bed and food. Let her rest. She has been through much." The guards assisted Tanda away, and Margaery stood in the courtyard, breathing deeply, her thoughts whirling. She could feel an undercurrent of relief. Tanda might provide valuable testimony to the High Sparrow about Cersei's direct involvement in stirring rebellion. It was one more piece of the puzzle that proved Cersei's guilt beyond question. But it also meant Cersei had grown bolder, resorting to outright threats and murder. That spelled danger for everyone in King's Landing, not least Margaery herself. She crossed the courtyard, stepping beneath a torch sconce. She summoned Ser Talon once more, instructing him to place discreet guards at Tanda's door. "We must keep her safe and ensure she does not vanish in the night," Margaery said quietly. "She is a key witness. If Cersei's outlaws learn she's here, they might attempt to silence her." Talon bowed. "At once, your grace." Margaery exhaled, pressing a hand to her temple. She felt a migraine lurking. Within the hour, she sent word to the High Sparrow, requesting an urgent audience. By late evening, she stood in a small chamber of the Great September with him, the flicker of candles illuminating the tension on both their faces. She recounted Tanda's story, watching his reaction. He appeared pained and determined, fists tightened. Ing around his staff. "So Lady Tanda has been used as a pawn," he said at length, voice low. "This is proof enough of the Queen Mother's involvement. The time has come to name her a traitor before the entire realm, if the king so wills it. This cannot continue." Margaery nodded. "I agree, but I counsel caution in how we proceed. Declaring her a traitor might rally others who quietly despise the faith. She remains Tommen's mother, and her name carries weight." His gaze flickered. "You propose we do nothing?" "Not at all," Margaery said quickly. "I propose we coordinate with the king. Announce publicly that Tanda Stokeworth has confessed to being coerced by outlaws acting under Cersei's command. The faith can add its voice, condemning these violent acts against the innocent. Then, perhaps, we offer a final call for Cersei to surrender herself. If she refuses, we brand her a traitor. It shows we gave her every chance to repent." He considered this, lips pursed, then nodded. "Very well, we shall proceed in that manner. But I warn you, child, if Cersei does not repent, the faith must treat her as it would any heretic fomenting violence. Her life would be forfeit." Margaery did not flinch. She pictured Loras's wounds, pictured the terror in Tanda's face. She swallowed. "So be it," she said softly. Cersei made her choice long ago, and so, over the course of the next few days, events moved swiftly. Tanda Stokeworth was publicly questioned by the High Sparrow in the Great September, with Margaery in attendance. The lady recounted her harrowing experience, citing Cersei's threats. Word of this testimony spread like wildfire. Tommen, guided by Margaery and the High Sparrow, issued a royal proclamation condemning the outlaws who called themselves the Lion's Loyal Men, and calling upon his mother to lay down her arms and return to the city to face justice. If she failed to comply, she would be named a traitor to the crown. The reaction across King's Landing was one of shock and a kind of hushed acceptance. By now, many remembered the humiliating walk Cersei had endured, and rumors of her flight had painted her as a desperate figure. Now the official stance of the crown was that she was an outlaw defying her own son. It was a masterstroke of narrative. Margaery watched from a balcony as the heralds read the proclamation in the streets, and she noted that the crowd's faces reflected pity for Tommen, scorn for Cersei, and renewed loyalty to the queen by his side. The High Sparrow had arranged for the faith militant to guard the heralds, a show of unity with the crown. No one dared protest openly. Yet as time crept forward, there was no sign of Cersei's surrender, nor did any word arrive from the rebel outlaws that they would lay down arms. Skirmishes continued in the hinterlands. Mercifully, the faith militants' approach to the villages remained measured, yet tensions simmered. Then, one gray afternoon, a battered rider stormed through the city gates, half dead from exhaustion, bearing a message from a small castle near a minor river crossing. The local lord claimed that a band of men in black cloaks had attacked, setting the granary aflame, and left behind the severed head of a faith militant officer as a warning. The High Sparrow's fury was immediate, and Margaery saw that any restraint he had embraced so far was at a breaking point. He convened a meeting with the Queen and a handful of top advisors in the Red Keep's main council chamber, the thick wooden door barred from interruption. Tommen, pale and trembling, sat at the head of the table, while Margaery sat at his right hand and the High Sparrow at his left. Lords who were friendly to the Tyrells occupied seats around, along with a few gold cloak officers. The High Sparrow outlined the atrocity in stark detail, holding the severed officer's tabard as proof. Tommen looked faint, as though he might be sick. "We can abide this no more," declared the High Sparrow, voice ringing in the chamber's hush. "These men have committed sacrilege upon a sworn servant of the faith. By all the seven, they must be brought to justice. And if Cersei Lannister is behind them, then she must be crushed, for she leads them to sin." Tommen's lip quivered, his knuckles white on the table. He turned helplessly to Margaery. She reached out to lay her hand atop his, giving him a reassuring squeeze. Then she spoke, her tone steady. "My king, I share the High Sparrow's outrage. Innocent lives and property have been destroyed. We must act. Yet we must do so in a way that secures peace, not endless war. I suggest we send a royal host, one that includes both the faith militant and the crown's knights, into the region. A show of overwhelming force might compel these rebels to surrender without a prolonged campaign. We can post garrisons to protect key roads and holdfasts." Tommen swallowed. Yes, that sounds right. We'll protect the people. We can't let them be terrorized." The High Sparrow inclined his head, though his expression was grim. "I agree with the need for unity. Let the faith militant march with the crown's men. Together, we will uphold the Seven's justice and the king's peace." There was murmured assent around the table. Margaery saw in the eyes of some of the lords a hint of relief. Others looked uneasy, perhaps aware that forging a joint host of religious zealots and gold cloaks could create friction. But no one dared oppose the plan. Tommen, assured he was making a wise decision, nodded and signaled the meeting's end. Preparations began immediately. The Red Keep's armory bustled with activity as men-at-arms were called up, swords sharpened, mail polished. The faith militant readied their own ranks, shining the seven-pointed stars on their breastplates. Margaery stood at a vantage point overlooking the courtyard, watching the formation of this joint force with mingled worry and resolve. She recognized how dangerous it was for the Faith and the Crown's men to ride side by side in large numbers. But it might be the only way to stamp out the rebellious pockets swiftly. If Cersei's outlaws saw an army approaching, they might scatter. And if Cersei herself was there, perhaps she would finally be cornered. Loras, still weak from his injuries but determined, insisted on joining the host in some capacity. Margaery objected initially. He was not fully healed, but he argued that his place was in the field, demonstrating that House Tyrell did not cower from the threat. In the end, she relented, provided he traveled in a litter for much of the way and relied on others to do the bulk of fighting. He agreed reluctantly, wanting to at least be present to advise, if not to wield a sword with his old prowess. Within a fortnight, the host marched out from King's Landing under a gray sky. A portion of the gold cloaks remained behind to guard the city, but hundreds more went forth, joined by a formidable contingent of Tyrell knights, over 200 men on horseback, plus foot soldiers, and several hundred Faith militant. At their head rode the High Sparrow's chosen commander, a solemn knight once known as Ser Addison, who had renounced his family name upon joining the Faith. Loras traveled in a separate wagon, flanked by a cadre of Tyrell sworn swords. Margaery stood on the battlements as they departed, her heart torn between fear for her brother and hope that this show of force would finally end the rebellion. Tommen stood beside her, gripping the battlement so hard his knuckles showed white. When they vanished into the distance, Margaery turned to Tommen and forced a reassuring smile. "They will succeed," she said, pressing a gentle hand to his shoulder. "And soon, the outlaws will be a memory." Tommen nodded, though he looked more anxious than ever. "I miss Mother," he whispered suddenly, eyes filling with tears. "Why does she hate us so much? Why can't she just come back and be peaceful?" Margaery's heart ached for him. She drew him into a half-embrace, letting him hide his face against her shoulder. "Some hearts are consumed by pain and pride," she said softly. "I wish I could ease that for her, but only she can choose to seek redemption. We must hold fast to our duty in the meantime." He sniffed, nodding. "I'll try to be strong, like you." Margaery felt a surge of emotion at his words. Admiration, sadness, protectiveness. "You already are," she told him, though she wondered how deeply the trauma of losing his mother's love might haunt him in the years to come. In the days that followed, messages trickled back from the marching host. They established outposts along key roads, questioned local lords, and advanced toward the forested region near Drillog Hill where the worst ambushes had occurred. A few minor skirmishes took place, but no sign of a major rebel force materialized. Some outlaws were captured and claimed no knowledge of Cersei, only that they'd been paid in Lannister gold by masked riders. The High Sparrow's knight commander pressed forward, searching relentlessly. Finally, nearly 3 weeks after departure, a raven came bearing news. They had found a large outlaw camp nestled in a remote ravine, complete with stolen supplies, black cloaks, and a hidden banner depicting the Lannister lion in gold thread. The Faith militant and the Crown's men surrounded the camp, but it was empty. Whoever had been there had fled deeper into the wilderness or escaped under cover of darkness. They left behind evidence, however, letters, half-burned, referencing instructions from the rightful queen. The High Sparrow's men scoured the ravine for any sign of the fugitives, but only found a few stragglers who surrendered, claiming ignorance. Margaery cursed under her breath when she read the letter. Cersei remained elusive, but each new piece of evidence confirmed her involvement. With winter's chill in the air, the outlaws could not hide forever in the woods, unless they had caches of supplies. Margaery suspected Cersei had anticipated a large-scale response and chosen to slip away, perhaps heading toward the Westerlands or the Stormlands. As the army maintained its search, Margaery remained in King's Landing, carefully guiding Tommen and reassuring the people that victory was close. The High Sparrow returned for a brief visit to consult with her in person, bringing along Loras, who needed better healing for his wounds. Loras was pale but lucid, relieved to be within the city walls again. The High Sparrow admitted that no major confrontation had occurred, though small pockets of outlaws had been defeated. He spoke with frustration. It is like chasing shadows. Yet we have found enough proof to declare Cersei Lannister an enemy of both crown and faith. Margaery nodded. We must ensure the realm knows it. Spread word to every corner. Cersei Lannister defies the king, commits violence in secret, and funds brigands. Let every lord be warned that aiding her is treason. Agreed, said the High Sparrow. She cannot hide forever. Our men will remain vigilant. If she emerges again, we will be ready. The next morning, Margaery sat at Loras's bedside in the Maester's tower, where he rested after the journey back. She looked out the window, seeing the city's rooftops and the faint glimmer of sunlight over Blackwater Bay. She thought of how many storms had come and gone. She and the High Sparrow had struck first, imprisoning Cersei before she could act. They had forced her walk of atonement, a blow to her pride and power. They had then weathered her flight, her manipulations, her attempts at inciting rebellion. Despite the continuing threat, Margaery felt a measure of confidence. Cersei was on the run, her resources strained, her supporters harried by the faith. House Tyrell, in contrast, remained ascendant. If they could sustain unity within King's Landing, keep Tommen secure, and maintain the loyalty of the small folk, Cersei's cause would wither. Yet the game was never truly over. Margaery took Loras's hand, offering him a faint smile when he stirred. She recalled her grandmother's caution, "Beware a wounded lion." The caution remained valid. Perhaps the proud lioness was still out there, wounded but not broken, awaiting a chance to unleash fury upon them all. If that day came, Margaery would be ready. She had the faith, she had the city's love, and she had her own unwavering resolve. She whispered a prayer to the Seven that the realm might be spared further bloodshed. But if war came, she would stand unflinching, a rose with sharpened thorns, determined to protect her family, her king, and the place she had fought so hard to claim. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with gold and rose hues. From her vantage in the Maester's tower, Margaery thought back to the moment she first knelt in the sept, offering the High Sparrow evidence that would condemn Cersei. She had known then the risk she took, but how far they had come and how far they might yet go. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, perhaps more rumors of Cersei's whereabouts. Perhaps the outlaws would attempt another raid, or perhaps new threats from other corners of the realm would arise. Margaery drew a breath, closing her eyes. She felt a quiet calm settle over her, despite her swirling thoughts. She had claimed her place in King's Landing not through brutality, but through alliances and compassion tempered by cunning. In the Game of Thrones, that was as formidable a power as any sword or battle axe. Night fell on the city, and the bells of the sept tolled softly in the distance. Loras slept, breathing evenly now. Margaery rose from the bedside, smoothing the blanket. She stepped to the window once more, gazing at the silhouettes of spires and rooftops. Somewhere, out in the darkness, Cersei Lannister nursed her hatred. It would likely end in a final confrontation, one that might define the fate of King's Landing itself. But for now, Margaery would not let fear rule her. She had won 1,000 small victories by anticipating her foes and forging alliances with the High Sparrow. She would continue to do so, playing the part of the gentle, devout queen while keeping her mind sharp as a blade hidden beneath silk. At last, she turned and left the chamber, her footsteps echoing down the tower stairs. Each step carried her deeper into the torchlit corridors of the Red Keep. Outside, the night's cool wind brushed the ramparts, stirring the flags that bore Tommen's crowned stag and lion. Alongside them, the banners of House Tyrell still flew, the golden rose bright against green. Within the keep, novices of the faith bowed as Margaery passed, for she was the queen who had bound herself to their cause, the queen who had proven that even a lioness like Cersei could be brought low. And yet, as Margaery glanced at the flicker of their candles, she remembered that alliance was a dance upon a razor's edge. She would continue to dance as long as necessary, for the sake of her family, her king, and the realm she intended to guide into a new era. An era where neither the tyranny of the Lannisters nor the unchecked zeal of the faith would reign alone, but where Margaery Tyrell's brand of patient cunning and gentle mercy might shape a better future for all. She made her way into her own bedchamber, dismissing the servants with a soft word. Alone, she removed her gown, letting her long hair cascade over her shoulders. She looked at her reflection in the polished metal mirror on the table by the bed. The face looking back was composed, bearing a faint smile, the face of a queen well accustomed to playing her part. In her eyes, though, she saw a flicker of steel. She reached to extinguish the candle, plunging the room into darkness, and lay down upon the bed with a measured sigh. Somewhere far beyond the safety of the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister walked beneath a moonless sky, plotting vengeance. But for now, King's Landing was Margaery's domain, and she would defend it with every ounce of cunning, faith, and resolve she possessed. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. Tomorrow always did. Yet she would meet them, as roses always did, with roots sunk deep and thorns at the ready. And so the night wore on. The city slumbered under the watchful eyes of the faith militant, and Margaery Tyrell, queen, strategist, and architect of a new order, found what little rest she could, listening to her own heartbeat and promising herself that she would never let the lion roar louder than her own quiet strength again.